I have a revision. Our December 10th policy review meeting has been moved to December 11th.
Be very short. Thank you, Madam Chair. Since the last school committee meeting, the Finance Subcommittee has not met. Our next meeting will be on November 10th at 8:30, which is a Monday. Thank you.
There's quite a bit going on, but I'll try to keep this report short as we have a piece of our meeting devoted extensively to capital. The Capital Subcommittee met on both the 14th of October and the 20th of October. On the 14th, we met with, there were quite a few guests, including Allison Steinfeld, the town planner, and Kara Bruton, the Economic Development Director, and they have prepared an RFP to search for to find a real estate development consultant to look for land for a ninth school or to support the expand in place policy or goal of how to meet capacity needs. And I believe that RFP it was discussed at length at that meeting and then briefly again at the October 20th meeting, and I believe that is now published and available to the public. So as of today, that RFP should be probably available on the town's website somewhere and is public. In the meeting on the 20th, we had a preliminary discussion of the short-term, how to meet the short-term space needs, and that is on our agenda for later. It was mentioned to me that the MSBA may have discussed the Devotion Project. Mr. Rowe, is there anything to say about that? Pardon? Oh, all right, well.
Yes, we have an FSA meeting, so feasibility study, looking at there were questions of the town and questions of the architect around the option we had chosen, the recommended option. And so we reviewed the specifics as to why the option one was the preferred. And they will be following up with us with certain questions. We're shooting for the November board meeting for approval. So I think both the superintendent and Ms. Sherlubsky were there.
I thought that it was a good meeting. They asked some good questions. I think we had good answers for a number of their questions as to why we picked this. As Mr. Rowe mentioned, why we picked option one. And looking forward to the meeting on the 19th.
And I will just say that my understanding is that we are still on schedule with our two active capital projects that are providing us new K-8 classrooms for next September. The Lawrence School addition goes on apace, and work is not necessarily starting with hammers and saws, but the contractor is underway on Old Lincoln.
Okay, anything else?
No, that's my report.
Okay,
Yes, the curriculum subcommittee will be meeting on the 12th of November at 8:30, and we are going to be discussing the curriculum overview and K through 5 progress reports that have been done by the it's a sort of what parents are getting now when you go to each parent from each grade level gets the curriculum overview for their grade, the expectations, et cetera. We'll know more about it when it's presented to us, because I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, I know that, but that's what we're going to be discussing at the next curriculum subcommittee.
thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did want to just take a moment to remember Tom Menino, whose death today, I think, came as a surprise to many, many, many people. And there have been, if you follow Twitter or any of the other social media, you will see many, many Brookline people weighing in on their personal relationships. I did not know the mayor personally myself, but he was iconic and will be missed. So with that, I have nothing else. We need to have a conversation about the legislative breakfast, but that can wait until we have some more feedback from our administrators.
All right, negotiations.
Nothing much to report. We are looking forward to our next negotiating session in the middle of November, November 17th. We have another one scheduled with the BEU for December 8th, and we look forward to those conversations.
Thank you.
Okay, the Policy Review Committee met yesterday morning, and we continued with our work on revising Section J7 of the Policy Manual, which is regards student discipline, which we are currently revising in order to be in compliance with Chapter 222 legislation that was passed. We have an interim policy in place, but now we're revising the policy that's in our policy manual. We expect to be able to bring that for a first reading after our next policy meeting. So you will get to take a look at the work that we have done. And hopefully we will also be able to begin looking at the attendance policy at our November meeting, in case the high school students have done any of their reconnaissance and want to let us know what's going on there. They can deliver that to us.
A long career in education, but I'm sure it will be an outstanding experience for you to see what local school governance is really all about in Massachusetts. I'm eager to hear your reflections. You really have no idea I am.
I just wanted to quickly call people's attention, just to update, because I haven't done it in a while, on Hancock Village, that the Zoning Board of Appeals will be having its deliberations on Hancock Village on Monday, November 3rd. And the plans have continued to evolve. At the last meeting, there was a particular question around the massing of the larger building. And there's been some changes in the configurations of units and whether there will be 4 bedrooms or there won't be 4 bedrooms. Some plans have taken those off the table, some have put them back on the table. So of course, we're looking at that, watching that.
Following it that closely, how many units are we at now there?
Well, there's actually three different plans on the table, so it ranges from 172 to 184.
Thank you.
Okay, if there is nothing else, we can move on to public comment. Thank you. All right, Maria Gurvich, did I pronounce that correctly? Please come up. Yep, up here, please, yes. So you have between 3 and 5 minutes, and it's our policy not to comment on public comment, but we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Okay. So, my name is Maria Gurevich. I live in South Brookline. I have 2 kids at Baker School, one in the 6th grade right now, and one in the 1st grade. And so I wanted to speak on the topic of the nature of the relocation plan for the 7th and 8th grade. Obviously, as a 6th grade parent, I am concerned about that. And with the 1st grader coming up sooner than anybody can blink. The short-term space plan contemplates relocation of the Baker 7th and 8th grades to the Old Lincoln School. From different reports that I've seen, it's slated to as early as 2015 and 2016. And the concern there is that there really isn't a definite plan to bring those grades back to Baker. There seems to be a plan to bring back the devotion school students where the relocation is necessary to accommodate the renovation, which has to go on, but there is no such plan for Baker students. And as a result, Baker stands to become the only Brookline school that will no longer be a K through 8 school. The indefinite nature of the relocation plan is troubling because the relocation plan is not due to renovation needs at Baker. Rather, it's partly intended to address capacity issues that are largely to be a result of the Hancock Village expansion plan, which was just mentioned. We should not have to bear the brunt of overcrowding and the possibility of the Hancock Village expansion. Aside from the pressure created by the Hancock Village expansion, Baker does not have any significant capital improvement or expansion scheduled in the town's capital plan, as far as I'm aware. Under the proposal, Baker students may be moved to Old Lincoln for the 7th and 8th grade middle school starting as soon as next year and lasting indefinitely. This strategy may become even more urgent as the Hancock Village expansion proposals advance, which are expected to result in accelerated student population increases at Baker that are not currently incorporated into the school department growth estimates for planning purposes. The potential for the loss of the K through 8th school for the South Brookline will destroy the neighborhood-based model that is key to high-quality education experience for which Brookline Public Schools are widely known. And studies have shown that kids who go through school through K through 8, in the K through 8 environment, are much better prepared and positioned for adolescent years and for transition to high school and beyond. As parents and teachers, we're also concerned over the condition of the Old Lincoln School, where our children would be moved for an indefinite period of time. Specifically, there are concerns over asbestos levels in the building, and in general, many in town have identified the facility as suboptimal. For the health of our children and teachers, a better solution could be to put portable classrooms on Baker property for some grades. And I know, Dr. Lapini, your report addressed that to some degree that you issued earlier today, but we still thought that it would be prudent to mention, to consider the option on the portable classrooms. It's better for property values, it's cheaper than busing across town, and Westwood and Newton are considering these options, or taking up these options right now. And speaking of property values, the change will undoubtedly have an impact to property values for families that live in South Brookline. Families like mine painstakingly seek out homes in the area because they wish their children to benefit from the neighborhood K through 8 school. Those families want to live in this area and have their children going to school in this area. If Baker were undergoing a renovation, Baker families would certainly adjust to a temporary measure. Lack of a long-term solution, however, is concerning to Baker families that have children in lower grades and wish to remain residents of South Brookline area. Baker students should not be treated as an experiment for the town of Brookline. If there is a town-wide decision to create a separate middle school and expire the K-8 education model, the town should consider whether to build Brookline High School into 7th through 8th grade facility or establish a Brookline Town Middle School with the goal to alleviate the strain on the elementary schools that are currently crowded and address the class size issue. More kids can participate in more sports and activities, and if you have 2 high schools, a middle school, or just simpler schools. Research supports this class size as an indicator for learning, for better learning. The relocation plan for Baker 7th and 8th grade was sprung on Baker families, teachers, and administrators. It is clear to us that discussions were initiated without consultation with the Baker community. The school committee now has to face the angry parents, frustrated teachers, and none of this is necessary to produce to a productive and solution for the Baker School. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Just one note of clarification, this is not a plan, these are options and discussions. So just the characterization of it as the plan that was sprung on everyone is not actually accurate. It is one of many, many, probably hundreds of options that we're going to be talking about. So
Which
it's
is-
not a plan at this point.
Point taken. Thank you
Great,
for your
Okay, any other-
correction.
No, just go ahead up, go ahead up. Okay, thank you. We have, can you come up to the microphone? Can you just tell us your name and your address?
My name is Elizabeth Schlossberg, and I live at 275 Beverly Road. I wanted to just thank the school committee for the office hours. It was really nice to talk one-on-one with some of you. I feel like you totally hear what we're saying, but I'm happy to read my comments that I had already prepared to the larger group. As a longtime observer of the school space challenge debate, a former Baker PTO board member, a home-owning Hancock Village abutter, and the spouse of a Baker and BHS alum, I am grateful for this opportunity to share my thoughts today. After reading the short-term space needs and options document, I see 2 problems. One, as Maria said, there's inequity with the option of Baker joining Devotion at Old Lincoln. Baker can't be a K-6 indefinitely without a planned renovation. But more importantly, I think the high school timeline, as outlined in the document, is way too long. I understand the wheels are in motion with Driscoll in the letter, but I really think it's inconceivable to use a timeline that has the largest grade, which is 5th grade, I have a 5th grader, being in 10th and 11th grade during construction, if I read this document correctly, at the high school when construction is happening. They're the grade that has been initiating this from the beginning, this conversation that's been going on since I was on the PTO board a few years ago. And the staggered schedule idea that was floated, I don't think is really acceptable as a short-term solution, and I really encourage more aggressive planning for the high school. I'm going to skip over the part about Baker going with Devo because I think Maria covered that. But what I really want to say is too much time has been spent in this process dealing with the smaller groups in town and the turf wars and the T-shirts and the buffer zones and the parks. I really think the town has to come together with a vision for the high school that all the residents can get behind. No matter what solution comes for the elementary schools, whether it's a 9th school or expand in place, there's going to be hundreds of extra kids not yet accounted for who will be coming to BHS. And if we can't fit the current 5th grade townwide when they get there, how will we accommodate all the kids who are coming after them? And I think this is the most pressing problem that the committee and Dr. Lupini should be focusing on right now. I think rising high school families like mine, I have a 5th and 6th grader, we deserve the same exceptional experience that our predecessors have had at BHS, and I really fear, honestly, that without vision from this committee and from the town, without communication, this is a great start, and spending, the students who are going to go through BHS in the next 10 years will suffer. I think having a substandard high school experience can be detrimental to our kids' futures socially and academically, much more so than not having a neighborhood school to walk to in K through 8. I think the stakes are just simply much higher for older kids. Without equitable access to AP teachers and classrooms in the high school, some kids won't get the opportunities they deserve for learning or for earning college credit. Without sufficient guidance and support, kids who need that extra hand or extra eyes on them won't have it when they need it most developmentally. And without a schedule that allows for opportunities for kids to have after-school jobs or the activities that they're into, they will miss out on so many important milestones that they need to experience developmentally as they become adults. Elementary and middle school parents who know parents with older kids who are at the high school now or just recently graduated, we've heard about the high-quality experience that's waiting for us at BHS. We just want what they've all had and what this town is about. That can't happen with the building in its current state and with the numbers of the kids coming up. Something really needs to change. And it's the reputation of our high school that's really, I think, the crowning jewel on this whole K-8 system. Everyone's so, focused on keeping it K-8. I think that's great. But the high school is what it's really all about to the overall group of people who are going to be voting and people who are the property owners and not just the parents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. So that's all the people that we have signed up for public comment. Is there anyone else here who wishes to make public comment? Mr. Stoll.
Mine will be brief. My name is Perry Stoll. I'm a parent of 3 Driscoll students. The document that was sent out today had a mention of the Driscoll SOI potentially hearing back from the MSBA in January. That was the first time I'd heard that date, and I wonder if maybe either later tonight or in some other form you can address. Was there any other, is that news? Is there some communication you have? Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to make public comment? Okay. Oh, okay, sure. Can you just tell us your name?
Of course. My name is Meredith Leary. I'm a parent of 2 children at Baker School. I have a kindergartner and a 2nd grader, and I know you've received some emails from me. And I appreciate your response. I know that your job isn't easy, and we all agree that it's very important. But I have to say, I and many other parents at Baker School were stunned by the late-breaking plan, and I know it's not a plan, but an option, and our lack of awareness that this was a possibility in such short order. It was troubling to me and many other parents at Baker. I want to underscore the special nature of our community and the importance of not using our large community as an incubator for an untested middle school on a short-term time frame. I'll say that I've read the document that you circulated today, and it reflects a good amount of hard work by a lot of people, and I know that your options are not easy. But I'll also say, when I read things like, this option does not appear to be available, given the timing implications of potential financing for the project through typical town capital improvement process, I hear that. What I'm saying is this is not a typical situation. We're in an extraordinary situation, and it's time for us to follow through and take actions to address immediately the extraordinary circumstance that we're in. But those immediate actions cannot be at the detriment of one part of our community, and taking one part of our community and putting them into an experimental middle school option. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Larry. That's all we have signed up? Anyone else? Anyone?
Thank you, Susan.
Give us your name, sir.
Emily England. I am a parent of 3 children at Baker School. I'm also the Baker PTO president, but I'm speaking as a parent today. And I'm also on my 3rd year of the school site council at Baker School. You know, I had this amazing speech written, but everybody has said so much stuff. I just want to add a couple of points. I stood in front of the selectmen last Monday in regards to the override, and I spoke to them about not forgetting the high school in the midst of this K-8 problem, and I spoke to Susan and Rebecca in office hours as well, but I want to say it to everybody, as like Elizabeth has said, is that we really need to start planning now. The 2009, the enrollment at the high school exceeded its capacity, and we don't really have a solution on the table right now, a doable one yet, and I want that not to go unnoticed. Let me just skip down here. I had followed the B-Space process closely, and I also mentioned this earlier, that I feel like Baker was slightly ignored in the space issues. I remember when HMFH had was considering different options.
I'll quote somebody saying, they said Baker is not an area where growth is occurring. And we all know that that's not true. And obviously, even before the 40B expansion, we saw this coming, and we were never on the table for an expand in place. We never were on the table for temporary solutions like modulars. And I feel like, again, a lot of people showed up and had very strong voices, and everyone fought for their own piece of the pie. And I would just like to reiterate that, you know, Baker, I don't want Baker to take the brunt of this. I think there are solutions, albeit none of them are great. They're all suboptimal, where we can spread the burden across the town, and not just hit Baker. And like everyone said, we're talking about moving 2 of our grades to a new middle school, and making us the only K through 6 in the district without a plan to bring us back. The other thing I want to say is Mary Brown has been principal at our school for 6 years. And in those 6 years, she has done amazing work with our middle schoolers. I have a 5th grader and 2nd graders. I came in when my daughter was in kindergarten, when Mary started. We are extremely high-performing school, as you know. We're level 1. We have a 97% rating. We perform really well as a K through 8. Mary, even though she came from a K through 5 in Weston, she's got something special with those middle schoolers. We have excellent MCAS scores across the board. We have middle schoolers in positions of leadership with the student council. They're mentors in the younger grades. They perform community service. They have an advisory period with Mary. They volunteer and run school events. They did all the face painting and tattooing at our Halloween party last Friday, and they showed up and volunteered and had a great time. And they're an important part of our community. I understand that something has to give, but I want to put politics and all that aside and try to come up with some sort of compromise. Baker is willing to do its part and share in the burden of this problem, but I don't necessarily think the answer is pulling 7 through 8. I have other answers, which I'll be happy to mail to you, that are probably going to be equally unpopular. But I just want you to know, it doesn't have to be 7 and 8, and it doesn't have to be just Baker.
Good,
Thanks.
thank you. That concludes our public comment period, unless there's someone else. Okay. Go ahead. You can just provide us your name.
Sarah Griffin. I live at 38 Clearwater Road. And I have 2 children at the Baker as well, in 2nd grade and in kindergarten. And I will not repeat what others have said, but I think the choice of, part of the reason I came to Brookline was K through 8. And the idea that 7th and 8th grade would be moved is not, I think is both not wise from an academic standpoint for our children. Those are the exact years when transitions are hard. And so I'm sure that others have spoken about this, so I won't repeat them, but just to say that a lot of us are very concerned that the 7th to 8th grade option, and I would agree, I have other ideas as well that I'm happy to email, that I think might be more tenable, but the idea that there's a 7th and 8th grade option with no chance of coming back from it does not make much sense for the children of the Baker School. So keep it brief.
Thank you. I'm sorry. What did you spell your last name?
Griffen.
Okay, great. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much, Ms. Griffin. Okay, that concludes our public comment. Unless there's someone else who wishes to make public comment. Oh, no. Please state your name and.
Sure. My name is Kathleen Mann. I live at 61 Grove Street, and I am a Baker parent of a 2nd grader. I think that many of the other folks have already said some great comments. I would say, number one, shocked is not the word to hear some of the most recent idea, not plan. I think that the community inclusion has got to be better advertised, better communicated, and better invited. I think that we all love Brookline and want our children to benefit from a Brookline education. K through 8 is fantastic. It may not be the only one. We may need to discuss that and how we do it, but I think it has to be community-wide, Brookline-wide. We understand that you've done a lot of work that can't be very easy, but I think understanding a little bit more of your pain and having a little bit more conversation like we did from 5 to 6. Thank you for your time. That was a very useful discussion. I think it needs to be broader to the broader school community, and maybe bringing it to the schools might be another suggestion, or finding more opportunities. I know you have tons of spare time all in your lives, just like we all do, but I think that this conversation feels sprung, and I don't think that's the way you want to do this. So You don't want us to feel surprised. You want us to feel included, just like you want the whole town to be included in this discussion. So my feeling is, I would appreciate greater communication, more voluminous communication, greater inviting conversation. I will try to be a better participant, but I don't think that as a citizen of our town that I want to be surprised. I want to be invited, included, and share your pain, because I think it's not, you're representing us, and we want to help you out with this challenging decision. So please, in future, greater communication, and we'd like this to be broader and shared by the broad town, not just by Baker. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Mann. Anyone else? All right. Thank you very much. I suspect a number of the things that have been said are going to be addressed later today or in the forthcoming discussions. I think Ms. Blaine, do you want to start doing this? Do you want us to move on? We can move on to the vote.
This vote is the same vote we've taken every year, right? Oh, maybe they're here. Oh, Linda's here.
That's who it is. I know he's Bob Mast. It's Linda Carlos.
Yes.
So, thank you. The item for the superintendent's report this evening is to actually introduce Scott Bouchard, who is going to assist me this evening in recognizing two of our students with the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents Certificate of Academic Excellence Award, which each year recognizes two of our outstanding students at Brookline High School. Mr. Bouchard.
Thank you. So it's a great honor for me to be able to introduce the two students to you. One is a student, Mr. Schiff, so I'm going to read Mr. Schiff's remarks about the student that he wrote for her college recommendation with just a few edits, and then it's Carol right here that I'll be speaking about. Okay? One thing, okay. Only in Brookline has OIB has become sort of a moniker around our school for things that make Brookline High, well, Brookline High. Carol Montalban Palma exemplifies that distinction as no other student can. She arrived here to start her freshman year from Honduras, speaking virtually no English, and was enrolled in our language learner program. Carol took all of her classes there, save math and electives, for 2 years, and even went from level 1 in ninth grade right to level 3 in 10th grade. To start her 11th grade, Carol enrolled in all mainstream classes and took a medical careers elective that involved an off-site component at the Longwood Medical Center. That experience had staying power in that she is currently taking the anatomy and physiology class as well as the medical interpretation classes offered at the high school. Carol's involvement in the medical field does not begin or end in the classroom. The past 2 summers, she has worked at the Brigham and Women's Hospital through the Steps to Success Work Connections program. Her first year, she was not able to be paid, so she worked as a volunteer, and her supervisor called the program coordinator to make sure Carol could return the following year to be promoted and to be paid. This year, Carol has been asked to continue her work there into the school year. Carol has worked as a babysitter, janitor, maid, and secretary while in high school. She volunteered as a student helper for the International Students Program, tutors kids in Spanish, and even started the new Latino student organization. In addition to learning English and now French at the high school, Carol has taught herself Russian and Dutch over the last 2 years, which impresses me. Carol's story is one that we need to hear more of. She took full advantage of the resources available to her and put together an academic and professional resume that would be the envy of many adults. Her pending induction into the school's, not so pending now, her induction into the school's National Honor Society is one consequence of her actions. The Outstanding Student Award from the Superintendent's Office is a fitting recognition for a young lady who has done so much. Only time will tell what the future holds for Carol. Only 4 short years here, and look what she has accomplished. Only in Brookline. Carol Montalban Palma.
Congratulations. This is the award that's given by my professional association, the Superintendent's Association, for outstanding academic excellence for our students. So congratulations. It's my honor to present it. How we doing, Rob?
Hello everyone, my name is Carol Montalban Palma and I'm here with my two brothers and my mom right there. And I just want to say thank you for this honor.
The second student is Dewan Hardy. Dewan's here. In the words of Miss Hers, who's here as well. It's a bit longer, but that's good. Since the 5th grade, Dewan has been involved in theater and singing. Growing up in Boston public schools, Dewan moved to Brookline in the 7th grade. The transition was difficult academically, but creatively he thrived. As Dewan caught up on curriculum, he was able to produce more and began to feel good in the classroom. During Dewan's sophomore year, there was turmoil in his family life, and he often needed to miss school or activities in order to help his mom and care for his younger siblings. The family had housing issues for the second half of the school year, which was a huge distraction for Dewan. During this time, Dewan did not have access to a computer at home to work on assignments until the school was able to give him a computer to take home for the remainder of the school year. His schoolwork suffered throughout this time, and he was frequently absent from school. At home, he often had to babysit for his 3 younger siblings and manage most of the household responsibilities, which left him little to no time to participate in his extracurricular activities. While he continued to participate in some activities, he was unable to be in student-directed plays or to attend auditions for the all-male a cappella group, the T-Tones. He never complained about his hardships, but rather handled these events as facts of life. His love for his family is strong, and he would go above and beyond to help them, even if it meant missing school. Since the beginning of grade 11, Dewan has stayed in Brookline with a close friend and his family, while the rest of his family moved to Worcester where housing was available. Under any circumstances, living with another family, different habits, expectations, and patterns can be difficult. Not living with your own mom and siblings, as you have your entire life, can be jarring and hard. He has surely missed the familiarity and comfort at times, however, he has adjusted extremely well. One of the biggest areas of growth and development for Dewan this past year is in his study habits, ability to organize and to plan his schoolwork, and the development of his critical thinking and writing abilities. Although very difficult on Dewan, he has made the most of it and, in the end, has thrived. At Brookline High, he's an active member of Camerata, the school's improv group, and many theater productions. His most meaningful activity, however, is singing for the all-male group, the T-Tones. He was not able to participate in 10th grade, but auditioned for 11th and 12th grades and is an active member. For the last 2 years, he has had one of the leads in the Shakespeare plays. He was named to be the lead in the upcoming BHS musical Hairspray. He performs these roles with ease, even though they are extremely demanding. And he also somehow finds the time to write and produce his own music. I have heard some of his work. Ellen has heard some of his work that he has created, and it is wonderful. Also, Dewan is very well respected by the faculty, having been chosen to work as a junior mentor to incoming 9th graders. The administration also recognized Dewan with a Collegiate Book Award, and the community recognized him by naming him for one of the Brookline Youth Awards. Dewan Hardy is a dynamic, soulful, and kind person. His passion for the performing arts is palpable, and it is a joy to see him here firsthand with us. Dewan Hardy.
How you doing, Linda?
I'll have to have the one help me with this. Sorry, I think I got it. Look, I'm sorry, I was gonna get one of yours.
We'll go on.
Sorry.
Congratulations.
Thank you so
Yes. Congratulations. This is, again, the award from the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. It's my pleasure to present it to you. Well deserved.
Thank you.
Would you like to introduce people who are here with you?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Dewan Hardy, and I'm here with Bob, Robert Mast, and Linda Carlisle, who are my guardians for the remaining year of my senior year. Also, Carol and Jose are my friends here as well. It's an honor to receive this. My mom and her siblings would have been able to make it, but they got caught up in something. But thank you so much.
How about we'll do the end? How's that?
Can I just have one?
You can.
Since I figured it out.
Oh, good.
Thanks.
Congratulations. Thank you, Mr. Bouchard.
My pleasure.
That's my report.
Thank you. Dr. Questions for the superintendent? Congratulations, we're all so excited.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome to stay, although it's okay. if you don't. Excellent. Thank you so much for coming. Congratulations. Okay, any other questions for the superintendent? All right.
I don't see Mr. Rittenberg.
Well, we're 25 minutes
Right,
ahead of schedule.
right.
Which is very exciting.
But I am certain he will not be upset if he came here tonight and you had already acted upon this, but that would mean that you would not necessarily have any terribly probing questions. We can probably handle some of the basic questions if you have them.
Excellent. So let me try to, let me just move it, and then we can have a discussion if we have a second. So our docket item is, 5, is a waiver for the MIAA Rule 53, which is about 8th grade girls and boys ice hockey. So the motion is to submit an application for a waiver of athletic eligibility, Rule 53, to allow 8th grade eligibility for boys ice hockey.
boys.
Which we have done historically. Do you want to say a couple words about?
Sure.
what is in current
We've actually done this a number of times. I think it's 5 or 6 years now. And at different years, we've done it for different levels of the sport, or both the girls and boys program on occasion. Right now, you may or may not know that we actually have a partnership with Newton South to play girls ice hockey. So we haven't used the waiver in the last 2 years, because we've had that partnership with them and we field one team. That's fairly common in girls ice hockey. The good news about the boys program is that we're now to the point, when we started this, our numbers were fairly low, and boys were eligible then to play even on varsity. So this request is only for JV, because our numbers are such now that this particular strategy has helped us build those numbers up to the point where we only need to make this request so that our 8th grade boys can participate in the JV program. Pete would be proud of me for remembering that our boys made the state tournament last year, which is, as for some school committee members who've been at this table for as long as I have, is really quite an accomplishment in terms of the building of that program. Numbers are up, costs are down because Mr. Rittenberg's done such a great job of scheduling ice time in different ways to have practices and those kinds of things. And we have a successful program in both the boys and girls through the strategies he's employed. So that's the request, and the principals have an added responsibility because of these 8th graders. They actually belong to the headmaster for disciplinary reasons and for eligibility reasons, so there's some work between if they happen to have students in their building. Principals were enthusiastic in their support for this program, and so we would recommend it to you.
So I've moved it. Is there a second? We can have a discussion. All right, Ms. Troupsy, seconded, so discussion.
I just have a quick question. How many students does this affect in the 8th grade, just out of curiosity? How many are actually playing at the higher level?
I don't remember that question this year in the session with principals, but the last time I do remember it, it was 4-ish. 3, 2, 1 year. I mean, it's in those numbers.
Mr. Lepsky?
So I know for all the high school sports, we do concussion sort of baseline testing. I assume
Anybody who plays a sport.
would be doing
JV or varsity, 8th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, goes through the same requirements that we have for all of our athletes.
Thank you.
And Dr. Lupini, sorry, I know I raised this at an earlier meeting, but Mr. Rittenberg's going to come back and talk to us about
We're
concussions,
trying to
right?
figure out when that will happen
Okay,
on our
great.
agendas, yep.
Thank you. And just for the newer members who weren't part of this decision, when the school committee first agreed to this, we had a long, long, long conversation about the safety of the students, whether or not they were going to be playing with other members who were substantially larger than they were, being older. And so this transition to just being JV has been very welcome, particularly in regards to the safety issues that were raised. And Pete Rittenberg spoke very well then and has since about the prevention of injuries and the kinds of regulations that keep the kids safe even when they're mixing with the older kids. So just so you know.
Okay, any other discussion? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? raise your hand. It is unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody should probably text Mr.
I was
Rittenberg
just thinking that.
and tell him he doesn't, he's got 20 minutes till he has to be here. He might not be here yet. Can someone text him?
I can do
Oh, no, sorry. Or email him.
Yeah.
Okay. So our next docket item is short-term capital options, which Ms. Coyne is teeing up.
Teeing up for me, thank you. Peter, would you email Steve, so Stacey would get that, and if you have a cell number on it, I don't think I do, we can tell him, all taken care of, handled for you. That's okay. You got time. You got it. So, what I want to take you through tonight, I guess make a couple comments about up front, is what we've put together for your use in looking at the short-term space needs and options and some decision points. You know, Sean Cronin and I have talked enough about this. This is not the first short-term space plan we've put together. Sean counts it as the third. I think it's at least the second. And one of the frustrations, I think, in this that was expressed by parents earlier, and certainly is frustrating for us as well, is trying to create short-term options that aim at a long-term plan, some of which doesn't exist. It's very hard to create short-term plans and match them up in terms of educational program when aspects of the long-term plan don't exist at this point. And the other comment I guess I'll make up front that I'm sure I'll touch upon throughout the presentation is that some of what we put in here in terms of this option's not available for this year, I mean, come directly from the way the capital improvement plan is put together, and there simply wouldn't be money available for us to begin to implement that option until July, which in the case of portable classrooms is not a timely enough fashion for us to have them in, and that's the reason for the statement. If when we sit down with Mr. Cronin in the coming weeks, which we're going to do around some of the dollar figures around some of these models, there's some other way of looking at it other than that, I'm all ears. But right now, I don't know of other ways of looking at creating those funds to move up some of these options. I will also say, I mean, we took a timeline stab at the high school, and while I recognize the concern about the timing. The timeline specified in here, as we've been saying now for a number of years, is a fairly aggressive one in terms of what's specified in here. If an SOI were to be submitted in the spring and if it were to be approved by November, that's a fairly aggressive timeline. And what we've tried to list, because I laid out a number of weeks ago, months ago maybe, this one idea of how you get to that longer term solution. Which people seem to have gravitated to as the solution to that. It's not. It's one possibility. I'll go through some others for you tonight, some other possibilities that we know we'll need to look at in terms of the potential for short term at the high school to get to the preferred longer term solution. So if I can figure out how to move it, there it is. It moved it. So the piece here is just to say that what we've tried to do here is to give you an overview of the space at each school in the system, the plans for creating space where such strategies exist, but the main purpose of this document is to lay out what we believe are the options available. And again, we believe those options are available within a certain set of beliefs and assumptions. I can propose lots of others too that don't hang together academically, that don't provide the kind of educational experiences that we believe we're trying to provide. But these seem to fit within that. A great example is, people have suggested from time to time moving 8th grades instead of 7th and 8th grades. And we've not included those options here because it entails at all of our schools splitting up teachers. How would we do that? It's much more difficult in smaller schools, which is what K through 8 schools are. They're smaller by the very nature, and it becomes much more difficult to provide programming when a number of those teachers teach in each of those grade levels. So again, there may be an opportunity to dig deeper and look at some of those, but we think it's much more difficult. What I've said here in the final part of this opening is that we believe through FY 2020 we need 23 additional classrooms. Now the one sort of big asterisk that I want to point out is we've made an assumption here about a number of consolidations. That 23 is before consolidations. Okay? So that doesn't include us taking a consolidation each year, if we're actually able to pull that off. But I think I've highlighted in the document some of the limitations of making assumptions about consolidations, right? I mean, we've talked about them at certain schools where we've been able to do them historically. Devotion, we've been able to do them. Baker, we've been able to make consolidations. I think I made a comment about one at Pierce. We've never had a consolidation at Pierce School, so that's not really a very good assumption, we don't believe. So let me get into the specifics of this.
Consolidation is?
Sure. Consolidation means we take a look at the enrollment in a particular grade level. Sometime during the summer, we monitor it. We take a look at it at the end of the year in terms of some grade levels that we think may drop to a point where we can actually consolidate a section, go from 4 sections of 5th grade at a particular school to 3, or go from 5 to 4. We took 3 of them this past year. So here are some of the assumptions that we used. We used an assumption about the quality of the educational experience, and I need to say here, because it was raised 2 or 3 times, that the work that Monica Crowley's doing around creating what we think is exceptional programming for students at the Old Lincoln School, I think is noteworthy. And we plan, as we get a little further into that, to have her come before you to talk about the experience that she is working with parents, with teachers, to design, to provide there. And I would not characterize that as experimental in any way. It's research-based. They've visited a number of schools that do a lot of the 21st century skills, high-tech kinds of work, and that's what they're looking at being able to provide for students during the time that we occupy the Old Lincoln School. We're projecting here, as we did in the next presentation that I'm going to do for you this evening, on override scenarios. We're projecting 650 kindergarten students each year, and we're projecting 31 sections of kindergarten each year. We're assuming that all grade levels follow a typical historical attrition pattern as they progress through the elementary schools, and that's why we make an assumption of a consolidation. Although we didn't factor it into the model because I can't tell you right now where they are. We targeted class size of up to 22 students in grades K through 3 and up to 25 students in grades 4 through 8, not averages, up to those numbers. So we know that many of our schools currently use substandard spaces for classrooms, for specialists, and for offices. So we believe that the plan described in this document, with the possible exception of adding a 9th elementary school, leaves some number of suboptimal classrooms at the end of this short-term plan. And we've started to lay out a definition, not a count, we don't have that this moment, but a definition of where some of the spaces in elementary schools fall if they're considered suboptimal. So we have some places where the location of the space restricts participation from all. Right? It's not handicap accessible to get there. That's a suboptimal space. It's too noisy. It's a classroom below a gymnasium, somewhere where the level of sound is distracting or challenging. That's suboptimal. It's too small. Some people last year criticized us and said, look, you're running a class at that school that has 16 kids in it. That's right, because we had to use a room that was not a classroom to run a class in at that school for that year. That was suboptimal. Fixed configuration. So when we use auditoriums for music classes, and in some cases do things like remove chairs, seating from that auditorium so that we can hold the class, that's suboptimal. When there's limited or no natural light, basement spaces, a number of which we operate, that's part of our definition of suboptimal. And when we have rooms with no shelves, bins, or closets available, and there's a limitation to creating space, that's suboptimal as well. So when we use that term, generally speaking, the rooms we're talking about fall into those categories. We've assumed here that grades 7 and 8 at each school must be located together, again, as I said earlier, given staffing patterns and middle-level programming employed in Brookline. We have 4 computer labs, other than the devotion one, which we're not counting in here at all, because that building's about to be renovated. We have 4 other computer rooms in K-8 schools at Runkle, Pierce, Heath, and Driscoll. We did not assume those spaces to be usable as regular classrooms for program and in some cases suitability purposes. Some of the rooms wouldn't work, they're small. Some of the rooms we have program in that we don't want to consolidate. We assume that office spaces within non-public schools of Brookline town buildings are not available, and any movement means we're renting space. So we didn't assume, for example, that the 2 rooms on the first floor in this building could be used as Pierce classrooms. Someone might want to challenge that assumption, but we didn't make that assumption. So we assume that when we move things out, we have to rent space beyond the $500,000 that we're spending now in the rental of space. Our goal is to implement strategies with continuity, keeping classes and programs in a location over a period of time. We've run some models where we have preschools hopping around the district. We've not considered those models because we believe we need to find models where we have continuity and where we have coherence, a plan with logical connections. To the point that was raised earlier tonight, When we move something, we would really like to have the next step. What is the next logical step in terms of the long-term plan? And so where we don't have that, we point it out to you, that that next step doesn't currently exist. We considered students and their programming, special education ELL, first when proposing any options for dealing with our short-term spaces. In other words, you remember an exercise we went through at Devotion, where we started out moving 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, even before the construction. And parents asked us to reconsider that. And before I said yes, we went back and ran simulations to show what would happen with the district-wide special ed program for 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and what would be the impact on ELL. Because if the answer to that had been no, we wouldn't have been able to propose moving just 7th and 8th grade. The answer was yes, it worked, therefore we were able to propose it. And we have no cost comparisons, although quite frankly we do have costs on some of these, but some of the things like modulars, portable classrooms, et cetera, we don't have great cost estimates. Again, we have a meeting set up with the town administration to begin to play through those and see how some of this might fit into the CIP. We've had some preliminary conversations in that area with Mr. Cronin, who's been very helpful, very supportive, but we don't have that final model built yet. So then I'll take you through each school one at a time. So let's start at Baker School. So we currently house 38 sections of grade K to 8. I'm not going to read to you the different grade levels there, but it's 38 sections. We have 3 sections, we have 4 sections, we have 5 sections in some grade levels. We project a need for 2 additional sections in 16, 1 in 17, 1 in 18, and 1 in 20. So we project to need 5 sections between now and 2020. Okay? And we project, so let me make sure I clarify this. We don't project Baker School as a 5-section school. We project that under the enrollment assumptions we've made, that particular area would need something to support 5 classrooms per grade. So I'm not suggesting they have to be at Baker, right? It may be part of the 9th school discussion. It may be part of some other discussion. I'm suggesting that our enrollment patterns show that we need 45 classrooms for students in that particular area.
Could I just ask you to clarify, does that incorporate some of the Chestnut Hill Realty? So, unfortunately, we don't really take questions from I'm sorry, but feel free to email us questions afterwards and we'll try to get them out. I assume there'll be lots and lots of questions. Sorry.
So only because it's at the end, I'll do it now anyhow. So we don't have any numbers baked into any of this that assume anything about the Hancock Village extension. Nothing. So we're identifying spaces for the current 38 sections. I would imagine people would agree with me that that's resulted in the creation of substandard classroom spaces at this building. The building includes a dedicated extended day room, which would not be suitable for a Baker classroom because of location. I think we stopped counting at 3 things on that substandard list that room would violate. And no additional classroom spaces are currently available at this building. We don't believe. So the options that we discussed here in the document were the possibility of putting portable classrooms at Baker. And what I said here is that this option does not appear to be available in FY16, given that there are not funds in the current CIP for it. They would need to be identified in the future CIP, meaning that they would not be available to us till July of 2015, which is not enough time to put portable classrooms in for next year. And the choice of this option would further tax the common spaces at Baker School, which are already overtaxed. We said that one option would be to use the old Lincoln School for grades 7 and 8 beginning as soon as FY16. And you saw the number of rooms that we need there. And most of the cost of that, there's no additional renovation necessary to Old Lincoln because that's happening now in the plan to renovate Old Lincoln. That's about a $3.5 million expenditure. The disadvantages of that are that it, again, as parents said earlier to you this evening, it's moving students to a building without a long-term plan for what happens to them from there. What's the next logical step from the old Lincoln School? We don't have one. It would mean that this choice negates the possibility of other choices. It negates the possibility of using the old Lincoln School for Driscoll students, if a Driscoll project were to move forward. It negates the possibility of using the old Lincoln School for Pierce School, because as you're about to see, Pierce is a very similar situation. So once you can use it once. You can use the option once, and that's it. And transportation would need to be provided, given our normal procedures in terms of transportation, and given that students fall beyond, in many cases, the mileage requirements for transportation. We would have to provide some transportation. We've not looked at that at all in terms of what that might be. The third is use of Baldwin School for kindergarten students. So the issues around Baldwin is that, again, it does not appear to be available for 16. The building's not handicap accessible. We have programs in there, and money wouldn't be available to do work that would need to be done to Baldwin until the FY 2016 CIP, meaning we couldn't spend it till July 1st, meaning it wouldn't be done for September of 2015. The option would move, again, students without a long-term plan. We'd be moving kindergarten without any plan of when they would go back to Baker or when they would go, and some of them might go to a next logical step, 9 school, whatever it may be. The choice of this option would displace Winthrop House and the Brookline Staff Children's Center to other locations that are not currently identified. And some people have said, well, Brookline Staff Children's Center, that's a separate program. They would own that. But Winthrop House, we own. Winthrop House is a very valuable program. Winthrop House is part of a strategy of making sure Brookline students can stay in Brookline, and it's part of a strategy around our out-of-district costs, and we need to be very careful with finding the right kinds of space for that program. So we could assign Baker kindergarten classes to Heath School through the use of buffer zones, Metco, materials fee, et cetera, meaning that we could assign one of those 5 classes, and we could use the buffer zones, we could use Metco assignments, we could use materials fee assignments to move that class to Heath. And the reason I say Heath is that we have a space there. You're going to see the limitations of that space in a few minutes, but we would be able to do that. Quite frankly, we'd also be able to do it at Runkle for a shorter time. There's a room that would be available for some time there as well. But all of those options, any of those options, would require the relocation of a Heath early education program in 2016. It's not slated to go till 2017, and we don't control space to put it right now. We don't have that space. The choice of an option for a second year would necessitate the relocation of the second Heath early education program. So we built a space into the Heath project for early education. It was part of the specs that we worked through with the MSBA, and we would be making a decision to essentially change that agreement with the MSBA and move that out of that building. The choice of the option would, I said probably result in, I don't know how it wouldn't, result in a change to our traditional sibling program, meaning particularly for Metco and materials fee students, we would no longer be able to honor our practice of having students assigned to the same school as their older brothers and sisters. That would certainly happen in this option. And transportation would need to be provided of some sort given the legal requirements. Okay? So those are options around that population. So at Devotion, we currently house 40 sections of K to 8, and you can see the breakdown there. We need one additional section each year from 16 through 20 for a total of 45 sections. 5-section school, and this is diagnosed and is written into its plan as a 5-section school, unlike the last school that I just talked about, where we've sort of just used the traditional enrollment patterns to make that forecast. Creating space for the current 40 sections, I think some people would again agree that that's resulted in the creation of some spaces that meet that substandard definition that I put out earlier. And we don't believe that any additional classroom spaces are currently available in this building. So that's really small, isn't it? But it's all from the plan. This is a plan, right? These aren't options. This is essentially the plan that's been laid out for the Devotion School, which has us renovating Old Lincoln now, which has us continuing to search for space to house Devotion School K to 5, although I'll say that location's not been identified. And the current building project estimates assume that grade K to 5 will be located on site, meaning there isn't additional funding for more transportation beyond what we've identified to this point. So the plan is in 15-16, because of lack of capacity, to move grades 7 and 8 to the Old Lincoln School, to continue to search for space to relocate grades K through 5. Again, we believe that appropriate spaces would need to be identified by October of 2015 if students were to be relocated, because by then we need to have a plan for construction that starts the following year, following summer. And construction phasing plans would be developed if Devotion students are to remain in the building, meaning we'd have to develop the plans, which we've already started to take a look at, as to how students would be moved around in that building as one part was demolished, another part was built. We move students into, right, all those kinds of phasings that would need to occur. In 16-17, construction begins. Grade 6 students join the 7 and 8 students. Again, we relocate those grades K through 5 if we found suitable alternative space. And if K to 5 relocation is not possible, we'd implement construction phasing for moving classrooms within the building. Construction continues in 17-18 while the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders are at Old Lincoln. 18-19 it continues. And if everything runs smoothly, in September of 19, we would reopen the renovation and expansion, and all students at Devotion, whoever was moved out during that time, would be relocated back to that school. This is where Dr. Fisher-Mueller says I'm supposed to say hoorah, and then go on to the next slide. Okay, so the overview on Driscoll is that the building currently houses 26 sections of K to 8, along with 1 section of early education. There's the breakdown on that. We project a need for 1 additional section in FY16 because the 8th grade, its 2 sections moves out and is replaced by 3 sections. That totals a need of 27 sections of K to 8 through 2020. We have 1 additional classroom space available in the building that we will begin utilizing in FY16. Okay, so that pre-K stays at that building unless you make other choices. So the Driscoll School plan is that the MSBA is expected to respond to the Driscoll School Statement of Interest. We say here now by January 15th. I will answer the question that was posed earlier. So originally we've been using a date of November. I don't know if MSBA is getting to any of the SOIs in November. I'm not sure they're getting to any of them. But we've been told that it's more likely that they will respond to SOIs now in January. Okay, that's and the reason, by the way, for that 2-month is that board only meets every other month. So if the SOI is accepted by MSBA, we would proceed with the MSBA through next steps and Driscoll feasibility. If it's deferred by MSBA, some people have said here if it's turned down, that's not likely. What's more likely is that there would be no action or a positive action. Those are the 2 most likely scenarios. But if it's deferred, the timing of resubmission needs to be evaluated against the urgency of submitting an SOI for Brookline High School as our priority. You will see in this document that we've actually recommended that an SOI would be submitted for Brookline High School in the spring. Any plan for the type of Driscoll School renovation and addition project described in our long-term facilities plan would require the use of Old Lincoln School for Driscoll grades 7 and 8 during construction. I think we actually forecast that could happen as soon as FY18, meaning the 17-18 school year would be about the soonest we would see that happening. And I think I have some notes on that later in this presentation. But again, if that were to happen, it negates the possibility of using that for Baker School students, the possibility of using it for Pierce School students, because our projections show that 6th, 7th, and 8th school grades from Devotion, along with 7th and 8th grade from Driscoll, fills the building. That's our number. So the building houses at Heath 26 sections of K to 8, along with 2 sections of early education. It's projected that we need 1 additional section when the 7th graders leave in FY17 for a total of a 3-section per grade level school. The building includes a dedicated extended day room, which would not be suitable for use as a Heath classroom because of handicap accessibility issues. So one section of early education will need to be relocated in FY17 because of that 7th grade moving out and being replaced by 3 sections of kindergarten. We'll need 27 sections. One of the 2 needs to go. If you were to look at the idea of moving other students in, as I said in the Baker School situation, you would need to move the second one. The second one, like Runkle, is built in a space that was identified for early education in the building project. So again, no additional classroom spaces are currently available in this building unless the last remaining section of early education is relocated. Lawrence School. So the building currently houses 32 sections of K-8. We project the need of 1 additional section in 16, another in 17, a third in 18, and a fourth in 2020, representing 36 sections of K-8. Creating spaces for the current 32 sections has resulted in the creation of substandard classroom spaces. The building includes a dedicated extended day room, which would not be suitable for a Lawrence School classroom because of the configuration, location, lack of outside lighting. We stopped there. No additional classroom spaces are currently available at this building. So the plan at Lawrence is this year complete the classroom addition project of 4 classrooms, and in 15-16 open those classrooms. But I need to point out to you that by 2020, we will be using other rooms as substandard. Still be using other rooms as substandard even at Lawrence, even with those 4 rooms. Okay? So it gets us enough classrooms to do, essentially, the way Rick Rogers describes it very well, I think, is that it gets us an all but 4 section per grade level school, meaning there's 1 grade where we only have 3. The Lincoln School. So the building currently houses 28 sections of K-8, 4 sections of grade 2, 3 sections of all other grades. The creating space for the current 28 sections has resulted in the creation of substandard classroom and I will say office space as well, mainly in the basement. No additional projected K-8 sections are needed through 2020. Creating space, the space for the current 28 has resulted in substandard, as I said earlier. And as of some date, that is when the 2nd grade exits the building, we actually need 27 sections at Lincoln School. No additional classroom spaces are currently available at this building. Pierce School. Another lengthy discussion, right? So building currently houses 37 sections of K-8, and you see the configuration there. Creating spaces for the current 37 sections has resulted in substandard classroom space. We project the need for 1 additional section in 16, 2 in 17, 1 in 18 through 20. Total need of 43 sections in 2020, and eventually, again, in this area of town, we're not projecting it necessarily at this point as a 5 section per grade level school, but we certainly have need here for those 5 sections per grade level. No additional classroom spaces are currently available at the building. So what we've laid out in terms of options here involve a number of ideas. So one idea is to renovate the Sperber Center and other spaces within the Pierce School to create additional classroom capacity for this building. There's some thought that we can get near the number of classrooms that we need by doing this and some other strategies in the guidance area, et cetera, where there could be renovation. The issues around that option is it's not available for FY16 because, again, funding would need to be identified and it would require construction. It could be completed for 17. One of the issues is that it would require us for next year to relocate our coordinators because the project would obviously be completed during next year, and our receiving and delivery operations for our K-8 schools. The possible space that they would go to has not been identified, nor has the cost of what that might be. And the choice of this option would further tax the common spaces at Pierce School because you're talking about putting more students in a place where our common spaces already barely work. Barely would mean, if you don't mind, 10:30 a.m. lunches. Portable classrooms at Pierce, also an option. Again, not available for FY16 because of our capital improvement plan. And again, choice of this option would tax the common spaces. Use of Old Lincoln for grades 7 and 8 as soon as FY16. Again, it moves Pierce students without a long-term capital plan to address the needs of Pierce School students. It would negate the possibility of using the Old Lincoln School for Driscoll. It would negate the possibility of using Old Lincoln School for Baker. And transportation costs, we haven't determined at all, although sort of a guesstimate says they might be less than some of the other options because of the proximity of the building to the Old Lincoln School. So possible classroom consolidations, which, by the way, I don't think I mentioned at Baker as well, so let me come back to that. But possible classroom consolidations is mentioned here, and I think I said this earlier. While that's a possibility, and we've factored a number in, we've actually not had a classroom consolidation at the Pierce School. So I don't think that's one I would identify as a strategy to put at the forefront for how I'm going to deal with the issues for next year at that school. Baker, I had that same option listed there, and some pretty significant number of our consolidations have come at both Baker and Devotion over the past number of years when we've made them. Some people have asked me what grade level, and the answer is yes. All grade levels, certainly outside of the primary grades, are where we've made consolidations. So the other option here is to assign Pierce classes of some sort, maybe we'll say kindergarten, to Driscoll School through the use of buffer zones, Metco, materials fee, et cetera. Has the same issues that the Baker assignment to Heath or Runkle has, right? It's not available long term. We need that room at Driscoll. We might have to move out. We'd have to move out the pre-K, again, where we don't own space to move it to right now. It would break up siblings. It would certainly break up siblings. And one other thing I want to mention here, you saw earlier in the year the breakdown that we gave you of buffer zones, numbers of students in each buffer zones. So this doesn't have, so the first part of this, Pierce classes to Driscoll School through buffer zones, actually doesn't happen easily because the numbers aren't large. I think last year's kindergarten, I think it was 3 to 5 students in that kindergarten. So there isn't a real opportunity there to do that naturally. Does that make sense? So that's a disadvantage of that model as well. Runkle School, the building currently houses 26 sections of K to 8. People will recall Ms. Charlepsky did in a note she sent me today that the building was built for 27 sections. That is correct, but we do have a 2-section grade in the building. We have 2-section grade 4 in the building. We project the need for 1 additional section in 2020 when that 4th grade leaves, which means it then becomes a 3-section per grade level school. So we have 1 additional classroom space available in the building. It will be utilized in 2020. It has a dedicated extended day room, which is not suitable, we don't believe, for use as a Runkle classroom because it is not a full-size classroom. But if we're doing 16s again, I suppose we could make it work. No additional classroom spaces are currently available at this building unless the remaining section of early education, which was included as part of this building project, again identified as early education in that building project, were to be relocated. But possible. Again, we don't own the space to move that class to at this point. The Old Lincoln School plan is that Devotion School grade 7 and 8 students will attend school there beginning in 15-16. The grade 6 students would join them when construction begins at Devotion in 16-17. That is the extent of the plan at this point. Now, the options that are available is to use the building for additional classroom capacity for Baker School, for Pierce School, or for Driscoll School, and it is an or. One of the 3. If none of the middle level options noted above were to be utilized, that is, if we were to solve them in other ways, because not utilizing this option means we have a solution in some other way to those issues, then there would be room for additional Devotion students, and I'm guessing here now, we've not run the simulation on the numbers, that possibly grade 4 and 5 could move there during construction. Devotion students would then return to the school for 1920, assuming we stay on timeline. And under the Devotion-only scenario, that is the scenario I've laid out here, the building would be available for use by the high school in 1920, assuming it didn't need a renovation of some sort at that time for differing program, or that there were no other elementary level needs for the facilities. As good of assumption as any at this point, I suppose. But that's the only scenario we see where Old Lincoln would be available for the high school in 1920, when we believe they need additional capacity, not that would, in order for us not to have to implement other strategies. So early education in FY15, we have early education programs in 16 classrooms at Lynch, Beacon, and Putteram, in addition to 5 located in elementary schools. There is no additional capacity at Lynch, Beacon, or Putteram. We must move at least 1 classroom from Heath in FY17 and from Brookline High School in FY17 under any scenario. Under any scenario. There is some possibility we might need to relocate 1 additional classroom from Heath, along with the Runkle or Driscoll programs as I've described here. You make certain decisions, we have to move 1, 2, or 3 more early education programs out. We controlled no space for any of those programs right now. There it is. We've currently not identified space for those early education programs. Brookline High School. So the building currently houses 1,895 students, depending on which day you're taking our enrollment from, I suppose. The enrollment projections for FY16 are here, 17, 18, and 19, and 20. In addition, Brookline High School currently houses 1 early education program, our adult and community education offices, meeting rooms, offices and meeting rooms, the 21st Century Fund, an alumni room, the Manville EDCO partnership program, and other rooms dedicated to student programs. So I want to be really clear here and say to you, we've had pretty in-depth conversations with our consultants around what happens, what kind of capacity we create at Brookline High School if we have all of those functions out of that building by a particular set of dates. So anything I say to you, for example, by FY20 we have this issue, by FY19 we might have this problem, is predicated on all of those functions moving out of the high school prior to that date. Already factored in. Again, some of those go more easily and programmatically, in a programmatically, I guess, working fashion, and others are more difficult. Right? We've talked about Manville EDCO, for example. Right? That may have to go to where EDCO is located. We've had some of those conversations with them. Adult and community education, much more difficult. Our early education program all have issues that we have to address. Now that is really small, huh? This is in the plan that you have, and again, it's just taken from there and put here. So what it really talks about is what happens with Brookline High School in terms of the plan as we understand it today, right, against those numbers that we described. So we are looking at the education plan, which is looking at models that could be advanced as a result of the study, a second high school, addition renovation to the current location, additional building with specific program focus. All of those are on the table. Considering other possible needs, do we need to acquire additional building or land? So we begin planning now for short-term strategies, right? So the one that's gotten a lot of airplay here is scheduling. So, and that's one option if we need to do our programming on site with our high school population as of, you pick the date X. And we were not to have enough space. I've heard people stand at the podium and say those options are unacceptable. Well, if we don't have the space, they're going to happen. They may be unacceptable, they're going to happen. So another is class size. There could be variations made to class sizes. And by the way, you can employ all of these. Number and breadth of offerings. You may reduce the academic program that you offer in an effort to create additional spaces. Or classes at Old Lincoln School, which, as I showed you earlier, is possible under at least one scenario in the year that we believe we need it, although I will say here, again, you've heard me say this a number of times, Mr. Mason actually disagrees with me. He believes we need it 1 year earlier than I project. 2015, 2016, Again, this plan would call for a statement of interest being accepted. I showed up here in 1415, it being submitted. We say here, under a scenario of a possible acceptance of the SOI in November of 15, planning can continue on short-term strategies. We'd have to identify a decision regarding the long-term Brookline High School solution and plan to move out non-essential programs from Brookline High School. 1617 could include the beginnings of feasibility study and schematic design. This is a pretty lengthy conversation we've had with Mr. Cronin in laying out some of these timelines. So it could begin as soon as that date. Planning could continue on short-term strategies, and we would begin to move non-essential programs. I believe in FY17 is when I said we would move the early education program out of Brookline High School. 1718, continue to look at those short-term strategies and complete the move of all non-essential, non-high school programs from the building. 1819, beginning implementation. If you're going to change schedules, that's the year before. You'd have to let parents know what those schedules might look like at that point. If you're going to not offer certain courses, you have to have that in place the year before. Possible beginning of Brookline High School project. Completion date, if it began in 1819, could be as soon as August 2021. Again, that depends on what it is. It depends on how extensive it is. It depends on whether it's even on the same campus. That is a total guesstimate. And in 1920, we'd have to implement short-term strategies. And hopefully, again, I've shown you one scenario where Old Lincoln might be available, but there are many, many, many other scenarios where it's not available in 1920. And we'd have to resort to other kinds of strategies. So some additional issues here, remembering that we are dependent on other entities, MSBA, the town, others, as well as financing for capital projects. And while we're not going to spend a lot of time tonight on the possibility of a debt exclusion, that is part of the ongoing conversation about override and debt exclusion as well. So some things, and we can certainly add to this list. This is the beginning of a conversation, as I said in the document that I sent to parents today. Finalize the long-term plan to address overcrowding at Baker School and Pierce School. Determine how a 9th elementary school and/or the Driscoll School project could address these issues. Hopefully we'll have a timely report from the space consultant that will assist in that. Agree on how additional enrollment projections for Hancock Village should be incorporated into the future modeling, because none of those numbers are here right now. And I've actually said here Baker School, Heath School, Lincoln School, and Brookline High School, because it isn't just a Baker and Brookline High School issue. Because of the way buffer zones work, right, you could be looking at buffer zones having to be used differently under certain scenarios, and those would drive students, and I probably should have added Runkle School here, those would look at driving additional students to Heath, to Lincoln, to Runkle as well, depending on what those projections are. Agree on the role Baldwin School can play in short-term and long-term elementary, and I know we've discussed high school plans. Address the need for space for programs currently located in this building. Determine how we would address physical plant needs at Lynch Center as part of these efforts. From the beginning of these discussions, I've said to school committees and boards of selectmen that we cannot lose in this discussion the needs for renovation at Lynch Center. If you plan to continue to use it for 10 or more years. Some things are going to need to happen there over that time. If Sperber is not converted for use by Pierce School, determine a timeline to upgrade the facility for continued use of offices and our receiving delivery center, because quite frankly, it's a fairly woeful place right now. And determine the role, if any, the Brookline Music School building could play, the potential for one classroom plus office space, the need for investment to renovate, the implications for Brookline Music School programming in this plan. This goes back to our discussions over the last year or so about classroom space that might be available there, office space that might be available there, and where we are in terms of us including that in future kinds of models that we put forward for you. That's it. Happy to answer any questions you may have. That's it, sorry. That's all I got.
say one quick comment before we start this. First of all, a tremendous thank you to you, to Peter, to Jennifer, to all the people who've done a tremendous amount of work trying to think about where the kids go. It's a huge jigsaw puzzle, and I think what we see at the school committee level is not something necessarily that the parents see in any building, which is that all of the pieces are interconnected. And so I'm a parent in the building, many of us are, or were parents in buildings, we understand the building perspective on anything, and that's the first page that everyone goes to, but I just really hope that everybody does take a look at the full scope of the problem, because all of the jigsaw pieces are connected, and I think that's just, I can't emphasize that enough. This is one town, and it's not even North Brookline, South Brookline, it is one town. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that you had mentioned the multiple plans. I mean, this committee, I'm so excited that I can do the when I was a child speech. Because I usually accuse Ms. Charlevsky and Ms. Stone, my, not necessarily, they are elders, my betters of when I was a child speeches, but I just want to say that this committee and the superintendent have been addressing this problem since at least 2007. And I'm not going to go through the entire litany of times that we have had external consultants talking about this problem, but the idea that this is absolutely brand new and why wasn't anybody paying attention to it. I've had a number of conversations with community members along the lines of, we are in season 5 of the television show, and people are kind of just tuning in, and they didn't quite understand that there was a seasons 1 through 4. But seasons 1 through 4 included multiple consultancies from MGT back in 2007, 2008 to talk about this. They recommended a 9th elementary school back then. There was just a huge reaction that was a bubble. We couldn't possibly build a 9th elementary school, so there was expanded. Sorry, what?
Sorry, that one I have to correct, because what MGT said was we needed a 9th elementary school and there was nowhere to build it in Brookline.
That also, and also the reaction we got was that's a bubble. It's not, like, there aren't that many kids. Those kids aren't going to be here for that long.
There was some of that. It was more about
Plays, Runkle, Heath, Devotion was part of that. We had a town school facilities group, a town-wide group, school committee, board of selectmen, building people who were all, I mean, a lot of different people were on there in 2011. B-Space was 2013, the override study committee was 2014. I mean, this is season 5, 6, 7, perhaps. And so I just want people to understand that this is not a brand new question, that these issues have been underway and have been being discussed. And I think what you said, Dr. Lupini, about resources being available and public will being galvanized around a solution to this is absolutely critical. So thank you for all of this tremendous work, and I will open it up to questions.
Thanks.
From the committee. Ms. Rothstein.
So one thing in what you were talking about, all the things that have happened, is in addition to all that, the building department has been working miracles on carving out spaces within the buildings to accommodate the children that are here. So that's been going along with all those other pieces. I had two question and a comment. One, in terms of the BHS offerings and limiting them, I'm not clear. I understand, raising the class size, or making sure that most classes get to the class size of 25 or so. But making the offerings less, I don't understand how that would, because if we don't run a class that's less than X size, what difference does it make what class it is we're running? Except
Well,
for those
so that may be the actual strategy that implements that particular item, right? That may be the strategy. And I mean, what you end up with is the thing that, none of us like to talk about, that I like fully scheduled students.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I like students particularly
Well, the
because
state likes it too.
Well, they do, but they quite frankly, they don't incent it anymore. They used to, right? They don't look at it anymore in the way that they used to, unfortunately, since we have a department that's more about compliance in other areas now than those kinds of issues. So there are many ways to do that. I mean, you can eliminate certain offerings. You can raise minimums on certain offerings. There are ways to do that, and quite frankly, the real answer to these kind of questions, if we ever end up there, as the headmaster and I have discussed a number of times, is really probably some portion of all of those options. I mean, I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that's helpful, because I think, it sounds like we're going to cut out everything, but we really
No.
aren't, because we
No.
still have students who are going to be in classrooms that we need to provide education for.
Right. Right. And the thing about those I'll just say this in defense of the model that I've talked about a couple times. While I don't love the model, I do have a couple colleagues now, and our headmaster's been in touch with the principals in those districts. And quite frankly, as a short-term strategy, in the case of one district that I think I've described in quite a level of detail here, they're doing it for 2 years because they got started late in terms of building a high school. It took a long time for people to recognize that they needed that high school, and now they're doing it, but it was too late. It was too late to implement it in a timely fashion, and so they had to go to another strategy. And they run a schedule. I saw it characterized one place as 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's what I had said. That's actually not true. I said 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. They run a schedule with 80% of their students each day. And one of the things the superintendent reported to me as a short-term strategy is students liked that, right? In terms of being able to choose a later part of the day, an earlier part of the day if they played athletics, a later part of the day, some of them worked in the morning. Again, all of these things are predicated on this is what you might have to do as a short-term strategy. When it becomes longer than a couple of years, then it becomes much more of an issue. And if it's a way that you continue to offer your academic program, it's something we'd have to look at. Again, if we're put in a position that that's where we are. And you can see that there are certain scenarios up here that would make it difficult for us to avoid those kind of conversations.
The second question I had was, and it's just, I'm not sure if you guys have discussed it with the consultant at the high school about year-round schooling, and that way you would have a quarter of the school out, or a third of the school, depending if you didn't.
So you're talking about a year-round model, because there are many, right? You're talking about a
Yes.
year-round model where a certain portion.
Just for the high school.
Right, where a certain portion of the high school population has off a certain semester out of that time. That's really just another version of a modified schedule. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It's no different than scheduling yourself from 7 to, right? It's the same kind of modeling. It's different in terms of the utilization of the building. It's different in terms of some other things. We've touched briefly on it as one of the examples of things that we might have to take a look at. Sure.
Thank you.
This is just a comment, but I want to make sure to mention the fact that if we look at this in the long term, over time, and think about what has happened in the past, through the CIP, every few years, schools have been renovated. Runkle being the latest example of this. We have a beautiful new Runkle school. It is a bit larger, but as you can see, it still probably isn't going to be large enough for the next few years. And Devotion will be renovated. But once that's over, unless the Driscoll project if the Driscoll project goes forward as opposed to a 9th elementary school, Driscoll will not be renovated in the same way that Runkle and Devotion have been renovated, and neither will Pierce. They'll be made larger, but it'll be these suboptimal spaces and so forth. Yes, we may get a 9th elementary school, but when you begin to look at the timeline for this and you think about the high school, we're not going to be able to do a renovation. Let's assume it's a 9th elementary school. The 9th elementary school and the high school will go forward, but it will be piecemeal fixing up for both Driscoll and Pierce, because you can't do all of that. We don't have the money for it. We don't have the capacity to do that. So what happens is we have just, because of the enrollment and financial issues and et cetera, we are no longer in that pattern that historically we have been in, that renovates schools every few years. And
40.
Well,
Every
yes,
40.
every 40 years. But Pierce Pierce is at that point.
Absolutely.
And we're not going to be able to renovate Pierce for, heaven only knows how long. So we're really in a very difficult situation here, trying to provide the best facilities we can. But I think we need to be realistic and say, in certain ways, we are really sitting behind the what is it?
Eight ball. It's the eight ball.
Right, because we can't do things the way they have always been done. And that's not going to make everybody happy, but it is a fact of life going forward. So I just think that needs to be on the table.
I'll match right now. Ms. Costa.
There was an article in the Tab this morning that suggested that maybe these plans wouldn't be necessary because we already have the spaces. And I know you've spoken to this before, but as Ms. Ditkoff has said, there are people who have come in season 5, and I wondered if you could, as the person who makes school assignments, talk about some of the difficulties of that way of looking at school assignment.
So, thanks so much. So my own personal opinion is that a model's a model when it actually seems to be applicable, seems to be workable. And I've tried to study this model a number of times and I don't find it to be workable. It makes assumptions that I suppose somebody else might be able to do. I don't think I can. My understanding is it assumes some number of seats are available. I've heard 800. I think I heard 600. We'd love to know where they are. But it does that by making assumptions like, thank you so much. It assumes a certain class size that's above where we are now by X number of students. It assumes that you can get there by essentially not honoring a number of things that we have in place in terms of sibling assignments, in terms of neighborhood schools. It assumes that all of those things are on the table in terms of moving kids around, that I can say, your oldest child, we have seats over there to get to our new 24. I'm sorry that you have other siblings at this school. We're going to move them. Well, in as much as anybody considers that to be a realistic model, sure, I suppose it's a model and it works. I just think there are too many assumptions that violate too many things that I've heard over and over here from parents and school committee and certainly our administrators about what we do for families and what we do in terms of neighborhood schools and what we value in terms of K to 8 and all of those kinds of things. So that's my issue with it. I mean, 800. If you say we have 800 seats, but you can't show me where they are, except to tell me that that you can get there by raising class size and telling people they're going to move from one school to another, whether they have siblings there or not, whether they live in that neighborhood or not. To me, that's a non-starter, but that's me.
Dr. King, would it be fair to say that it's a combination of things that we are already doing and things that we would not consider?
Well, it's a good point. Right. So why do I leave some of those things out? Because we've adopted them. I mean, my understanding is that the author of the model has said on a number of occasions that our assignment patterns of the last 2 years are about as positive, tight as you can get, meaning we have an average class size of 21 and we range from 20 to 23. That's about as tight as you can do it unless you want to start violating some of these other pieces. So, the suggestion was that we back up our assignment date for students. Right? We did. We now moved back our kindergarten orientations into June so that we don't have to assign anyone till May. Right? The idea was that we not assign students in the summer until we have more information. We didn't assign anyone till August 15th. Right? Because they did under the sort of the theory that they didn't have to attend a kindergarten orientation. And therefore, we could assign them that late and whatever. The model does not take any of the information about ELL that we've discussed into account. None of it. And 38% of our students were tested for a language this year. How do you ignore that in the creation of a model? So, yeah, it's a number of things that we've already done and a number of things that quite frankly don't work and a number of things that I think the author misunderstands pretty drastically. How do you really feel, Bill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, get off the fence, Bill. Tell us what you really think. I do agree that I thought it was unfortunate that the whole concept of reassigning students to solve our problem was reintroduced, because I thought that had been asked and answered many times, mostly through the Override Study Committee process.
Actually, the Override Study Committee decided not to endorse that approach in its final report.
Right.
One individual.
Right. And it does, it speaks to one of the things I wanted to mention, because it came up in our office hours, it came up in a lot of the comments that the parents made tonight at the podium, that we are in fact committed to the K-8 neighborhood model in Brookline. We are committed to that regardless of whether or not some of our 7th and 8th graders need to go temporarily to a different model, that is not ever considered as a long-term solution. It may look like it's in perpetuity now because we can't put a date on when it would go back, but that it will go back and that we are committed to the K-8 model is, I think, as close to sacrosanct as we get in Brookline, which is why we're looking so carefully at what we thought was not an option after the MGT study in 2008 and after the B-Space process. We thought a 9th school was not an option. And we are going one more time back to that because it would, in fact, solve so many of these long-term questions. We would be able to move students with a reasonable amount of disruption. We would be able to free up and in the long run fix the suboptimal spaces in our existing elementary schools. It solves so many problems. It's not that we don't want to do that, it's that we've been told twice by outside consultants that we can't. And so we've been looking for these other options. But this bottom line of the K-8 neighborhood model, which is what the article in the paper today completely ignores, is in fact a bottom line. And I can't imagine even any future school committee moving away from that.
So can I comment on that? So it is a bottom line. It's why we make the comment in here that this particular option of moving 7th and 8th grade without a longer term plan, maybe it should have said, to get back to the building back to a K-8 it makes it a more difficult option. I mean, if people need reassurance on this, I think they need to go back about a year and a half now to when there were conversations about other models at B-Space. And some members may recall the not-so-friendly letter that we received from the MSBA about the decision that we'd made as a district, when we accepted funding for Runkle School and Heath School to have K-8 schools, right? And that even the idea of playing around with that idea at that time got a letter to the town administrator and to the superintendent letting us know how MSBA felt about that conversation. So on many different levels, we are committed to K-8 models. In fact, I'd say we are committed to pre-K-8 models if we can get back to that conversation at some point here.
And that actually is part of the 9th.
And that is part of the ninth school as well. I've been thinking a lot about Vicki Milstein tonight. In fact, I think we have to actually put her on video with the speech that she gives, because she does it better than anybody else. But it's the other piece of what I just found myself. Vicki Milstein is our principal of early education, so early ed and kindergartens, and she is wonderful. And one of the things that Vicki has been forced to do by all of the moves that we have made for pre-K in the last several years is come up in front of parents every single year and reassure them that wherever their children are physically, they will be getting a fantastic educational experience, because what we put our resources and our talents into here are extremely competent, wonderful, caring, talented teachers. And we make any space that the kids are in suitable and appropriate and sometimes even beautiful for those students, even when we have to move them around. And it is again, along with the neighborhood schools, it's not just a core value. We live it every day. We live it no matter what we have to do in order to accommodate crises like this. And that is also a promise of this committee, it's a promise of this town, that the education is still wonderful. The teachers are still wonderful. The physical spaces are going to be a problem for the next many years, and we are all going to have to deal with that. But the promise is to the educational quality and to the safety and security of your children in those spaces. So all of those things are promises. We can't build them into the options, except we can promise that, you know, if the Baker 7th and 8th has to go to Old Lincoln School, which is being renovated, it's not going to be the pit that everybody talks about. In fact, it never has been, but it's really not going to be after the renovation. They will be going back, right? We are committed to that model. So
let me make a comment about the early education. So you know, there are lots of places where this whole idea of coherence and continuity, I mean, you described what we've tried to do in terms of programming. The question I'm asked when I go before those parents every year is the program going to stay there? Right? Do you have a plan? Or is this just a one-year hopscotch across town? And so it's one of the reasons that we built this plan in the way that we did. It's why even some of what's in here doesn't make great sense to us. The idea of relocating a class to the Heath School, it doesn't make great sense, right? We built them in because we knew we were going to have to look for some short-term measures, maybe why modulars, portables were put in. So we built in some of those kinds of things. But every time I've talked to parents about the early education programs, they've wanted to talk about the continuity of those programs. Are they going to stay here? Are they going to be here for some period of time? And are you all working on a plan to bring them back to elementary schools? Right? And that we're putting out rent. Again, for people who come in season 5, it's over $500,000 in rental that we're spending on an annual basis to support the locations for our early education program. And as you'll see in the next presentation, we're actually projecting higher figures over the next coming years for spaces that we don't yet know where they are.
So there was, Madam Chair, with your permission, there was one more thing specifically to your discussion of the CIP and its capacity, which goes directly to the ongoing conversation about the potential for the debt exclusion override in the spring, and why the argument is to exclude the argument that the selectmen are having is between excluding just a portion of the devotion project to be paid for with a temporary increase in taxes. That's what a debt exclusion override is. It's a temporary increase in your taxes to pay for the service on the debt for a building project. And they are temporary because eventually you pay off the debt and it goes away. But the reason that we have repeatedly said that it makes more sense to do a debt exclusion override for the full devotion project is because the CIP desperately needs to free up its capacity so that we can take advantage and move more quickly on some of these other options. So when you talk about the CIP not having funds in it until 2016 for something like portables, which could solve problems in the short term and reassure parents that their kids are not going to have to be shuffled all over the place, it seems to me that that's the strongest argument I've heard for the larger debt exclusion, because the CIP clearly needs more capacity. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to be able to jump on.
Mr. Rose, say a word to this.
Right, I just wanted to throw out the numbers that the Deputy Town Administrator was working with. If you think about the two recommendations that came out of the Overage Study Committee, what was called Group 1 and Group 2, the lower number would have allowed for a $36 million debt exclusion to just complete the Driscoll's, the Devotion School project, where the Group 2 recommended an additional, essentially $36 million that would allow for us to have another project to follow immediately thereafter. So that what that effort would do would be to allow for that additional capacity, and then for us to define where that is based on this conversation about these issues that have been put in front of me.
No, I just wanted to be sure that we were keeping our eye on that, because it seems to me that the other place that's not in here, and I wondered if you thought about it, that I know that there is land still at the Heath School, that if we had to create classroom capacity there, and we could do it with a truly temporary portable trailer as opposed to this modular construction, which is really much more long-term, but if we're really talking about short-term capacity, could we not create that capacity at Heath, for example, for early ed classrooms so that they wouldn't have to go somewhere else for rental? You see what I'm saying?
I do, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose we could. We haven't looked at that at all. Quite frankly, our goal has been to group early education classrooms, right? To keep multiple classrooms in one place. Our preferred kind of site would be a place where, if I go back to this plan, where we could locate at least 3 classes and probably a 4th that's coming along in the next few years, right? A class that doesn't presently exist. I mean, that would be our first preference, to create a site.
I was just thinking, you were, in the options that you were showing us, there were a number of pre-K classes that might move out in order to produce the.
Right.
Right? And if we could group them, for example, at Heath, since that was one of the options that you put forward, that maybe it would have to move out of Heath, and that, right? But if we could keep it there and add to it with using a portable.
Right.
Because for pre-K, a portable, and Heath it has that benefit of that huge park right across the street.
We'd have to look at it.
I would just add that to the things that you're considering, that so we could get some data on it.
Yeah, we'd have to look at it. I want to go back to the other issue, though, and we have not tested at all 3 years, 4 years, whatever number of years after a project, using a room that was identified in a building project as X for Y. We've not done that at all, and particularly if that room might need some sort of renovation. I mean, it was built as a pre-K classroom, probably as a kindergarten, right? But if students are then aging to first grade and that's still the room, because you're still going to need it, right? You run into other problems. We'd have to test that with MSBA.
Yeah, except that, well, yes.
I know it's done.
Right.
I just want to make sure that, like the 7 through 12 conversation, that we were addressing it, in some kind of proactive way and not waiting for a letter.
Right. In the past, I mean, I don't particularly like the sort of testing with MSBA on everything.
Right.
And I think the community was understandably aggravated.
Right.
By the degree to which that conversation was driving some of the conversation and decision-making in the past. On this particular issue, I think they would probably be pretty flexible, but who knows? As you
we'd
said.
have to test it against the cost versus the cost of the rental versus the idea of grouping all those things would have to be tested.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we're talking about short-term issues.
For 2020, yes, that's a new.
That's short-term.
Short-term.
That's short-term, but it's, as my colleague here has said, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and so we're sort of always talking short-term and long-term, and I have a couple of sort of items on both, but just at least starting with short-term. A statement and a question. So my statement is that I have confidence and expectation that you and Dr. Fisher-Mueller and Monica Crowley will create a condition in 2019 where this room will be full of parents who
are protesting that we're decommissioning the middle school at OLS because it's been such a successful academy and is providing such a really exciting model that serves the needs of some of our children.
Based on our conversations to date, I believe that.
Ms. Cohen, will you please put that in, and Ms. Fisher from the tab, can you just put that down? Because we're going to need to Google that in a number of years, this prediction for people who are showing up in season 11.
So the question really that I have to ask you, which, because you've given us all these projections of we need a classroom next year here and then 2 more the year after or whatever. We've got all this growth, but we do have these large buffers. And so the models that you've suggested for addressing the short-term growth are these competing models of moving the 7th and 8th grade out of this building or moving the 7th and 8th grade out of that building. But do you think that there would be a perhaps more difficult to plan for and administer, but a feasible path of using the magnet of this 7th and 8th or 6th, 7th, and 8th grade academy and all of the kind of special opportunities that it has to offer to draw off the overage, the students enough to kind of stay in balance for the short term, just to manage this short-term issue. And then there's obviously short-term, we hit up against the wall in 2019. And before I let you answer the question, I just want to get to one of my long-term points. 2019 works for providing OLS back to the high school to deal with its capacity.
Yes.
Only around the devotion project. And let's look, because you've identified just by 2020 we need 23 more classrooms, and we need more than that beyond that. And how long have we been in sort of urgent process on the devotion project? So far, how many years have we spent? 3 solid years working on it to be done in 2019. And we need these 23 or 27 or 30 more classrooms at other places than devotion, and none of those projects are started. So the long term is just as urgent as the short term, because we can't get any of, no matter which one it is, we need 5, we have the demand for 5 sections in the region around Baker. We have the demand for 5 sections in the region around Pierce. But just, so I'll let you answer my question.
So the first thing I want to say is I think Dr. Fisher-Mueller wins the bet that we had, which is that eventually we'd get back to the very first idea that we put on the table, which, right? And I think it was you who said, eventually we'll get back to the idea of a magnet school, middle level at Old Lincoln School. So thank you very much. I think Lab school, thank you. I think I owe her lunch or something now as a result of that. From the beginning, I mean, we're very early in this discussion with Ms. Crowley, who's doing a really amazing job, and teachers, I will say, teachers at the devotion school are very excited about the things they're looking at and they're talking about. We've talked about all along that where there are seats, at the very least around your idea, right? That where there are seats, no matter what we might have to do, we believe we're going to put forward a recommendation to you to open them up, right? And we believe we'll fill them because of the experience that's being talked about there. We believe we'll fill those seats. Because I've had enough people come to me and say, I had a brief conversation with Monica. That's the kind of experience I'm looking for. That's what I'd like to look into that. Look more into that. So whether we do it that way and start it that way, I don't think it's something that could happen initially. I'd love to talk more about that if we had the space available longer term, right? Beyond what we might need the high school or something like that. But that's been part of our discussion from early on is just in terms of whatever school or schools we end up with there, in terms of being able to open that up for others who may choose that building. And for every comment, not for every comment, but for a number of the comments I've heard about, people not wanting to look at that. I've had a number of people approach me. I know Monica will tell you the same thing when she's here and talking with you about what they're planning. Come and say, I'm not one of the schools that's being talked about. Is it impossible for me to look at that experience? that you're planning at Old Lincoln School? And we think the answer should be, it's absolutely possible within open numbers of seats for you to look at that experience for the number of years that we're open.
Can I just-
Actually,
I just want to comment on that. because-
yes, on that point.
Go on.
And actually, to support that point, our policy allows for that.
Yes. I'm not sure we'd need to do a thing in order to do that.
And that would be my sense.
I'll take that as a motion and a second.
I'm
allowing you.
Thanks.
So first of all, I made a mistake earlier. We're in season 6, not season 5. Thank you to the people texting me. I got it. Number one, so we're in season 6, just for the record, Ms. Fisher, Ms. Coy. But I just want to, one small piece of seasons 1 through 5 on middle schools. I think that there was along the way always interest from a group of parents who were interested in that as an option. They thought for their child that that would be a better option for their child. I think what we also heard loud and clear, though, was that this community is committed to
Right.
K-8. And so I think where things got tripped up in the earlier conversations was when those assignments weren't voluntary, they were mandated. So for example, assuming that a school that had, let's say, 4 sections would go down to 2 sections of 7th and 8th grade in that building and assume that either there would be half of them would go to this new middle school model, and if they weren't enough volunteers, you assign them there by lottery. I think that's what started getting tricky for people, and without that sort of assignment, you didn't reliably, Mr. Rowe, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't reliably get enough students out of the building to actually solve the capital problem. And so if you want to use that as an interesting pedagogical innovation, my guess is that on a voluntary basis, there is going to be support in exactly the way. But
So
just
we may end up
rewind
somewhere in the middle.
Right, so just to rewind the conversation, if you can't reliably get them out, then it doesn't reliably solve the capital problem. And when you start forcing it, that's when you start getting community reaction.
So thank you so much for reminding me of that model that I think I proposed at one point for a discussion.
That was the B-Space discussion.
Pain
when
sort of
we
came
were,
back to my neck as you were going through that, so thanks.
Okay.
So, bottom line, it might work, but it's tough to rely on it as the plan.
Rely on it, but again, as part of an option around the other things that you need to do, and then a conversation when those people show up in 2019.
But I wasn't trying to solve the problem of making sure we have additional pedagogical models to offer the Brookline families. That's a lovely idea, but I was really just trying to stick to the knitting and say, could we use this as a way of managing the short-term capacity issues over the next 3 years?
None of the models that we looked at, even way back when we looked at that, said that you could do it reliably, right?
That's the problem. Maybe, the answer is maybe.
Maybe. Right. Well, maybe's tough, but it could be, right. So on the long term, with all of this growth, both already here in our, as you said, the model for the growth in the Baker area to demand for 45 sections is not including any additional families at Hancock Village. That's beyond that sort of. So we've got this big piece of anticipated growth there. Same thing at Devotion. You add it up everywhere. It's 23 classrooms. And we're now going to be looking at the possibility of positioning a 9th school, and we have no idea where. It could be anywhere in town. In B-Space, Ms. Stone and various others worked diligently doing some modeling of how school assignment might change based on creation of new capacity in either specific places or even in general areas. Like there was a model for a 9th school district in North Brookline without, the school wouldn't have to be on any particular piece of land, just you add that one. And do you think it would be possible and desirable to start that modeling process again, using maybe updated numbers and students and information to kind of get out ahead of some of this, like where do we, another direction or set of data points for evaluating the options that
Sure,
we
because-
can come up with?
Yeah, the answer is yes, it would be. I mean, not only did it look at, as I recall, percentages of students, numbers of students that might need to be moved, it looked at whether there were actually neighborhoods around neighborhood schools and things like that in particular locations. And I think a number of those kinds of models, again, because some of this discussion's changed. People pointed out tonight that there wasn't much conversation about Baker or other areas in some of the past conversations. And I think we're going to need to run those same kind of modeling exercises to see whether even if we found a location, it would be something that would be of value. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of one of my great curiosities, because one of the things that was amazing about that process is the reason that modeling got started was to see what would happen is if you built a K-8 at Baldwin. And we were very surprised. I mean, some people may have anticipated that there weren't that many families around Baldwin, but when you started looking at the impact, it was shocking, because that district went right up to the gate of Baker and Heath. It just took the whole of that part of Brookline. And one of the questions in my mind is if you were to, could you, what would a Baker district look like with growth where you built capacity elsewhere so that you constricted the district around Baker to serve its neighborhood really? And is there an ability to sort of, build capacity in Central Brookline or North Brookline and address the Baker problem, or do you really need more physical classrooms near?
We don't know. We don't know what the shifts look like.
So we could look at that.
Right.
Yeah, that would be great.
And in fact, we've heard from a number of folks in the South Brookline area questions about different abilities to buffer differently in the Baker zone, some of which include buffering Hancock Village differently, buffering other pieces of the Baker district differently. So I think
Yeah, and to the point you raised at the beginning, and I really appreciated about, how this all sort of hangs together. I mean, those are great comments if you're talking about some other location being available. If you're talking about the schools that exist, it reminds me of the Devotion Lawrence Pierce issue when people say, well, don't put any buffer zone kids in our building, put them at Lawrence, put them at Devotion, put them at Pierce. I mean, the schools all have similar kinds of issues in terms of the capacity and what's still available. So they all create problems. You really have to look at this across schools. But again, as an exercise around another location, it's a very different conversation.
Any further comments? So I'm sure you don't want me to ask this question, but what's next? Right? What is our next?
Oh, no. It says here, this will provide the school committee with, where did I see that? Where was that? Oh, yeah, outlining options available. I mean, we have a meeting set up with the deputy town administrator. We're going to try to do that next step so I can take one of those assumptions off that says there are no costs here, right? So that we can put some costs around some of these kinds of things. We can figure out where they might fit into some CIP. To Mr. Cronin's credit, to Charlie Simmons' credit, to Mr. Rowe's credit, they've done some of that work already, provided Sean with a laundry list that he's not terribly happy with the length of right now, and start to boil that down in terms of what that might look like, add those pieces. And then I think we need to continue to have conversations, whether they're capital, whether they're here, whether they're both, about these things. I said before, and I got some strong reactions from some people, we're too late, right? We're late on a number of these things. We've been talking about them for a number of years. And to your point, we got comments a number of times from a number of different decision-making groups that this is a bubble, this is not going to happen. I remember distinctly the MGT conversations when they put forward 3 different proposals of what enrollment would look like. And members of that committee said, you can't go with that top line. That's too drastic. Nobody will believe it. And in fact, our enrollments have exceeded that top line that we didn't go with. Right?
Our enrollments have more than doubled that top line since 2008. They were at like 600 was what they would see growth, and we've grown more than 1,000.
So anyhow, so they've exceeded that projection, right? So we're to the point that's been raised. I think Emily was here. She raised it at a couple of of the testimonies about the high school and whatever. The timelines are tight because these things take a long time to develop, and we really need to get at them. So let me just say this. So, you know, we had a senior staff meeting today, and we spent the second half of that meeting with Monica Crowley, right? Who needs to plan for what's happening in 15-16, what's happening in 16-17, who's coming, how do I begin to work with those families, as she's doing already at Devotion and doing a great job of. But we want a quality experience. Whatever we provide here, we need lead time to provide that quality experience. So it needs to start now. We need to get those costs for you. We need to continue the conversation. And as soon as we're possibly able, we need to come to some decisions on some of these short-term items.
So just on that, I think, let me ask the committee a couple things. One is, it would be very helpful if over the weekend or when if you could go through this and jot down further questions and comments about it. I think there are a couple things I heard today that we might want to, I don't know if this is a living document or not, but things like.
Sounds like it might be.
Things like, that we should write down a document somewhere that this doesn't get a renovation for Pierce or Bristol unless X, Y, or Z happens. It's just worth writing down.
Right.
Or your point about the pre-Ks don't come back into the buildings unless certain things. So I think there are just a couple of these things that we know the community's going to be interested in, and it might be worth documenting them, and there might be others as well. I think your point, Dr. Pini, about getting ground estimates for costs would be terrific.
Yep.
I think the other thing that would be helpful, at least for me, although maybe this is clear for other people, is just the timeline of when we need to be making decisions. So you mentioned Monica needs time to plan. We know the Devo architects need time to figure out phasing.
Yep.
Right? We know the CIP has its own timeline, town meeting has its own timeline. We know the override has a timeline. Like, there are lots of timelines, and so I think it would just be helpful for me anyway to know which of these decisions has to get made when, so
Right.
that at least we're ahead of our
Right.
own decisions. And then I guess the last question is, there were sort of a bunch of things in here that would be really helpful to do. I mean, so one was the assumption that we're not using any town office space. We're going to continue to rent office space. I think that might be the kind of thing that would be useful to quantify for the town, for our community, and say, we are spending X thousands of dollars, tens of thousands plus, on office space, and if that were available from the town, that would be an efficiency, shall we say, that money that we didn't have to expend because those are town-owned offices. So anyway, I think it's probably worth quantifying that, and I would say the same thing is probably true about, and similarly to Hancock Village or other types of redistricting scenarios, so that when this ninth school advisory consultant comes, his process is happening, that information, which we've promised to that person, is we're ahead of that. We're not crunching to get that on the back end. So I guess I'm just feeling like there are a number of pieces that we're talking about, and I would love to see them on a piece of like horizontal paper someday.
I understand you need to see them on a horizontal paper, but they're like balls up in the air.
Not all of them, though.
Well, so many are dependent. So if, for instance, we found a space for the ninth school, well, that would change a lot of the other timelines.
Sorry, I'm just literally talking about the next number of months. I'm not even talking about the whole
okay.
thing. I'm saying
All right.
what I heard from the superintendent is that we need to be making decisions on a bunch of this. We're already late. We need to make them as expediently as possible. I guess what I'm saying is there's some information that we've been talking about that we need to make some of these decisions, some of which we're not going to have.
Right,
But-
exactly.
But, okay, but if we have to make a decision without having the information, I want to
We
write
can
that
always
down
go
also. I
back,
just
yeah.
want- I don't know
And we
how
can
to
always
say it.
change the decision if better information becomes available.
Feel better. Dr. Jackson?
So, to that point, and to your point, Bill, about the long-term urgency, I'm sort of stuck in that earlier conversation we had during office hours. I'm wondering, so short-term is now defined as 2020, between now and 2020, as you started off to say. And yet, is there a real possibility, and should we be thinking, to your point, as we sort of try and figure out which decisions we're making about what moment in time, that we should be both saying to ourselves, here's how the jigsaw pieces fit together with all the juggling balls over the next several years to 2020, and here's what happens if we don't have answers to the questions and we have to make a decision for 4 sections in 2016 now. Like, let's say we get to that, and so we have a conversation where we say, okay, we figured out what to do in 2016, and in 2017, 18, 19, and 20, depending upon blah, 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 we could be here. So I'm just wondering if both of those ways of thinking make sense for us at this stage in the game.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
I was merely going to suggest, because it's so nice to be in a position to voluntold someone else, that what you're describing in terms of a schedule sounds like a perfect opportunity for the chairman of our capital subcommittee.
And he didn't put his finger on his nose fast enough to
Since that is, since that subcommittee is the sort of space where we would continue this conversation in the immediate future. And David is so good at putting together things like that, both vertically and horizontally. And maybe you could do one of your many colored charts for us on this one.
Mr. Pollock. What happens under a 90 and a 65% budget override scenario? Is that more or less right?
Yes. I just need a minute, is that okay? No, he wasn't. Thank you. Oh, thanks. I'm just getting a water. No, that's okay. I'm just getting a water. So I don't want to do a barber here. Just a little height. Jennifer's getting me one. Thank you. Yeah, whatever. I think cold ice would be something. Huh? Yeah, thanks. Sorry? You're welcome. Oh, you're wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I think you're wonderful, though. Are you ready? Should we go again? Are you ready, Madam Chair? I am. I can be now. I'll wait. That's fine. Okay, so welcome back. The second topic we're going to talk about this evening is the 90%, the 65%, as they've come to be characterized, the override scenarios for what's in front of the Board of Selectmen for FY 2016 through FY 2018. Let me sort of set the context for this first. This is an oldie but goodie. This goes all the way back to the advisory committee, I understand, in terms of the one of the presentations to the advisory committee about the override. And you saw in that presentation, I used this in our first presentation with the Board of Selectmen as well, what we were looking at in terms of the problem, if you will, as laid out against our models that we had put forward of staffing and other areas under certain enrollment assumptions going forward. And essentially at a 1% collective bargaining agreement, that original gap, I'll use that word, was 12.3 million, and at 2% was 14.5. And it made certain assumptions about steps, about special education costs, health insurance increases, et cetera. Now, one of the things I want to say here, and we'll say a number of times throughout this, is that some of those things have been changed. Mr. Cronin has modified some of those assumptions. We pushed hard, if you remember, in terms of that original presentation on two things. One was the one-time money that's currently in our operating budget, and the second was on the 1% assumption for all 3 years, FY16 through FY18. And so what you see at the bottom is Group 1 and Group 2 in terms of, from the Override Study Committee, in terms of the numbers that they put forward for an override, for a revenue override of 5 million versus 7.9. The 2.9 million that's there in non-tax revenue and reduction on the town side in terms of expenditures of 2.9 was consistent across the two groups. And what we looked at then was the gap, right? So we looked at the gap in that next box with a 2% collective bargaining increase being 6.6 million for the Group 1 set of assumptions, 3.8 million for the Group 2. But when we added in what we have out there now in terms of one-time money, it increased each of those by $1 million to 7.6 and 4.8. This was the model that showed the gaps between Group 1 and Group 2 over the 3-year period. And then we also put forward this, where we started with those assumptions of what they laid out in terms of gaps. We added in an assumption of 2% collective bargaining instead of 1%, and that left you with these gaps of 6.7 and 3.8. We added in the $1 million of reserves that are in our current operating budget, and it left you with gaps of 7.7 for the Group 1 set of assumptions and 4.8 for Group 2. And that's how we left our conversations with the Board of Selectmen in that first presentation. They at that point said, can you come back? Can you talk about your model? Can you talk about these two sets of assumptions? Can you talk about what you'd be able to do within them? And that's when conversations began about, is this a hard number or is it a model, right? Is it truly 5 million and 7.9, or are we talking about a 65% given this new set of assumptions and a 90% given this new set of assumptions? Then Mr. Cronin looked and adjusted things like health insurance and some other town-based revenues, other things within it, and all of those pieces were factored in, and that's why it says actual gap with adjusted revenue, updated cost projection as of 10/23 at a 2% collective bargaining. So it showed that funding gap actually being 14.2 at the 2%. It showed that using those percentages, the 65% model, the 90% model, that those overrides, when combined with the revenue and expenditure adjustments, actually were 9.2 million and 12.8 million, which left us, in terms of taking our model, right, adjusting our model and new information that's come to us since, and you're going to see some new pieces of information that have come to us since, that in Group 1's model, we would have a $5 million gap between our model and the amount of funding proposed through this 65% group assumption. And in the Group 2 assumption, the 90% assumption, again, taking into account what they would support in terms of a revenue, of an override, and the town revenue assumptions, we were left with about a $1.4 million gap to try to close. So what we've done for you this evening, and I'll take you through a little bit of the detail of how we got there. What we've done for you this evening is tried to work to those numbers using our beliefs, using our programs, using what we believe those programs accomplish for the district, and attempting to create two models that work in as much as they work. Okay? There's obviously a lot of refinement to go on between over the next week or so, but remember that the other piece we're shooting toward is a November 10th discussion with the Board of Selectmen as to where we are with these conversations. So, again, we've said all along, this is a slide from that presentation with them, that there were three sort of buckets of decisions that could be made in terms of getting at these numbers, right? You could look at the model, and you could choose to create different ratios in the model or to curtail or reduce certain initiatives in the model. That's one set of assumptions. You could look at programs that we currently operate, right? And you could identify things in those categories. Although we pointed out that evening that the Override Study Committee does contain a statement about the number of consolidations, elimination of certain positions, that we've been successful at operating with less, yet still producing great results for students. And the third category is looking at these programs, these policies, these beliefs, and making adjustments in them. Or you could do some combination of all three. We were, because we talked about this in our workshop last week, we were cognizant of our strategic plan, our core values, making sure that as much as possible what we put forward to talk with you about aligned with those core values, and quite frankly, where it doesn't, that we point that out to you. Because I'll give you a headline that I don't think surprises you, that we had a bit of a challenge in meeting the expectations of the Group 1 model. Okay? So, let me walk you through the 90% scenario. And I know one of the things that we talked about is we didn't want to have a deep conversation about 0.2 FTEs, and neither do I, but I think this will give you an idea of where we are in relation to the initial model that was put forward in some of these areas. Some things that have come up, new information. We have a program review on enrichment and challenge support that we're on the way to receiving, that we've actually baked in some assumptions here. I talked in the first presentation about additional rentals. We've baked in some assumptions around rentals above the $550,000 into this model. And quite frankly, in the second model, we've taken some liberties with that we've discussed with Mr. Cronin already. So let me walk you through this. So we increased staffing for guidance counselors and psychologists, and we've actually laid out the years. I don't know if they're hard and fast. Again, they were based on certain assumptions in terms of enrollments. By 8.0, the original model was based on a different ratio. It would have actually driven more, but we believed that we could get somewhere in accomplishing what we were trying to accomplish across the elementary schools, the high school, at this number of 8.0. We increased the high school administration by 2.0. The initial model, I think, was 4. But again, what's happened to us since in some of the modeling that we've looked at is the high school you've seen increases at a percentage that's slower rate of increase. So we've felt that some of those could go into discussions beyond FY18. We increased K-8 classroom staffing to reflect the revised enrollment patterns, including an allowance for one classroom consolidation each year. So we're consistent here with the plan that we just discussed with you in terms of assuming a consolidation each year. Remember that a consolidation at the elementary level is 1.3 FTE. An add is 1.3, a consolidation is 1.3, okay, in terms of the modeling. We increased Brookline High School classroom staffing to reflect revised enrollment patterns. So we took a look at those patterns in the 4th through 8th grade, and we made adjustments to those numbers at the high school to reflect those increases in high school staffing. We increased K-8 vice principals by 1. That's Old Lincoln, right? And it comes in, it comes in FY16, which may actually be 17. We're not sure yet, but it'd be one of those 2 years. We increased the central administration by 3 positions over the base of the 21 FTE that we currently have there. And the specifics, as you know, will come from the discussion about our administration and compensation study recommendations, which we expect in January. We increased instructional materials and supplies by 4%, which was a lesser percent. Mr. Rowe, the original, can you just help me with what that was? Instructional supply. 10 the first year and 5 every year after. We had to scale that back to meet the 90% model to 4% increase in instructional supplies and materials each year. We increased staffing for school nurses by 2.0 instead of 3.3, as you would find in the model. We increased staffing for the elementary world language, again, to maintain enrollment, the K through 5 model. We increased the allocation for custodial repair and maintenance by the $170,000 that I believe was in the original model. I think we had good logic model in there about the increased amount of square footage around Old Lincoln School and those kinds of things that we were going to need to address. We increased related services, student services, by 13.3 in areas in occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech, board certified behavior specialists, team facilitator roles, and as was pointed out by the Override Study Committee, number of those things are regular education interventions. Regular education interventions, not what I would categorize as special education. We implemented the 3 years of the technology plan, the $1.54 million across the 3 years from 16 through 18. And we included the addition of 2.0 FTE to enhance the Steps to Success model by extending the program into primary grades, expanding the program beyond public housing, or making other changes after, and I would underline after, a program evaluation. Because I think which way to go with that is still open for debate, even among the board. We lowered the amount that we targeted for innovation funding to $100,000. It was some figure above that when we started that conversation, and increased it by 10% over 17 and 18 so that we can use monies to incent teachers to apply for innovation grants and then model them for colleagues. That was a goal of ours from the beginning of this discussion. We implemented the middle level model for elementary world language in grade 6, which is right now 3 day a week, but we implemented it as a 5 day a week. That's an additional 1.8 FTE. We brought that on in this model in FY17. We increased the literacy specialist staffing by the 8.0 designed to fully implement the literacy intervention model across all of our K-8 schools. That was the number we identified up front that would implement that across our schools. We've included that as a program improvement in this model. By the way, the thing I should have pointed out is you'll see that we've actually broken these into different categories. The first 3 pages of this were all enrollment, specifically enrollment driven. Then we got to a list that includes program improvements, although quite frankly, some could argue that some of these things might be both. Math specialists, we fully implemented the intervention and coaching model across all of our K-8 schools with 7.6 FTE. And we increased enrichment and challenge support program staffing as recommended in the Program Review Committee to enhance the program across all of our K-8 schools. The recommendations, the preliminary work that we're looking at now includes 1.5 building-based teachers, expanding the coordinator position to full-time, and adding 1.6 FTE mathematics specialists associated with. And I'll leave that discussion of that set of recommendations to the curriculum subcommittee for down the road for now. The base assumptions here, remember, from the model were that we would increase special education expenditures by $2.3 million over that period of time. That was included in any of the base models, that we would include $550,000 for rental of lease space for our early education classes currently located in non-public spaces, along with an additional $200,000 for rental of space for some of the other things that we talked about earlier tonight. And that we included an assumption of $679,000 in startup costs to open the old Lincoln School. That's been in the base model from the beginning of this. We had a discussion, I believe, with you last year about what made up that $679,000. And that would be the 90% model. So why don't we do this a little differently? Why don't we stop there on the 90% model? Because what I have for you from here is one version. It can be one version of the 65% model and then a comparison of the two. I have both of those in the slides.
I have actually two questions on the ECS program. The mathematics specialists will be specifically ECS math specialists, or will they be?
Right. So it's an increase in, at the microphone, an increase in the math specialist number so that they can attend to those issues with that program, that kind of coaching and intervention model with students.
But is that a 1.6 greater increase over the previous item where we're
It is.
increasing? So
It's
that's
a different 1.6.
the different
Yes.
1.6. And are all of those designed for increase in the first year?
Don't know yet. I mean, Mr. Cronin will be very interested in that, should this be where we land in terms of actually looking, if you recall from his modeling, actually looking at where he's spending money and where money might be available after the first year, not spent by the schools till year 2 or year 3. But we're not there on that piece yet. As much as I can get specific for you on some of these other things, we're very, very early in that discussion. But we didn't want to not include it, right? We want it in this modeling so that, because it's been a very important topic of conversation, right? A very important program review. And you're going to be discussing it this year, and for it not to be actually modeled in this next 3-year a program wouldn't suffice.
So I have a question about the old Lincoln School startup costs.
Yes.
And it's, I'm not sure who should pay for it, Peter or Paul here. I mean, but in most of our schools where we've had temporary locations for students, those costs were under the building cost of the new school. Here we're putting it separate, and I don't know if it makes a difference, or are these different kinds of costs than what?
You want to speak to this?
I mean, either way, we have to spend the money. I'm not questioning that, and I'm not sure where it should go, to be honest.
The answer to your question is it's varied over time. For instance, you may remember when we did the 9th grade school at the old Lincoln School for the high school.
Yeah.
We added to the high school project some staff increases for the high school for a couple of years.
Right.
That's really the only model that I can recall where we actually added operating staff. In the Runkle model.
VP at Runkle.
That's right, we did. We did a part VP at Runkle. I can't remember doing one for Heath. Yeah.
And we did, and you did one for
Did we?
Lawrence years
Okay.
ago, yeah.
So those are two examples where we did a piece of a staff
But it was
member.
a piece of one staff
Yeah.
member.
So the answer to your question, though, is that the $679,000 was based on saying to open a new school, in addition to a principal and a vice principal, we would assume we'd need office staff, custodial staff, Northeastern aid staff, food service staff, those, the basics of opening a school. So that's what it was based on.
And because we have two different sites, the cost that we would have incurred at the
Well, those are the additional
Motion
costs.
School.
Those are the additional costs of operating a site. The teachers for 7th and 8th grade are assumed to be
same
pulled
cost.
from devotion and moved to Old Lincoln School as a neutral. If you could, right?
Yes.
Now, that's
Yes.
That's a stretch potentially, but that's at least the working assumption we have right now.
Right.
And that same model would have to be true of a second school if we chose to do that in order to have a neutral cost.
Right.
Let me just say this. right? Mr. Rowe's absolutely right,
I get it.
except that it's a little bit above, right? For people who come from 7th and 8th grade who teach social studies, that's a straight move, right? Where it gets complicated, and we've discussed this before, right, is in world languages, for example, where somebody may also teach in the 6th grade or other parts of the elementary, and what we're left to do is try to extract pieces of FTE, and it may be easier in some cases, depending on the number of students at the building, and this is where, Ms. Dickoff, you said earlier about the need to make some of these decisions sooner rather than later. So we're starting to talk about staffing, right, patterns at the building. If we're going to, if we're going to include another school in that, it might change everything in terms of certain things like a world language, right? So we're going to have to go ahead and start making decisions based on 7th and 8th grade that I hope hold till spring, and that might mean adding staff, extracting pieces of staffing, those kinds of things. So it's a little bit of both, depending on the positions.
Thank you.
Great question, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lupini. I just have a question on the slide about the increase in K through 8 classroom staffing, which also mentioned an assumption of including a allowance for one classroom consolidation per year. And one classroom consolidation, as you mentioned, is about 1.3 FTEs. So the 6.5 and 16, 7.8 and 17, 3.9 and 18, does that include the 1.3 consolidation pickup per year that is in that number?
Yes.
It does?
Yes, it's a net.
So my next question is, what is the assumption on the average class size for K through 8 for that period?
Same assumption that was in our earlier presentation of 22 and 25, as upper limits, not averages, but as upper limits. Same assumption. We had 31 kindergartens each year, and we bring in 650 students.
Got it.
That's the assumption.
Thank you.
Others, thank you. Bill, I know, I know how hard this is to do, and so I'm sure that what I'm about to ask you doesn't have an answer, but it's sort of what I'm feeling I really need in order to be able to process all of this. So this is the 90% scenario.
It is.
And we've got things like increased staffing for guidance counselors and psychologists by 8, right? Which, in light of enrollment growth, strikes me as a really important place for us to be investing. Materials and supplies, at 4%. I'm trying to get a context for this. The school nurses, the elementary world language, even custodial repair and maintenance. And the technology plan, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, what aren't we able to do? To what extent are what you've put out here at 90% not allowing us to do what we hope to do for our students? In particular around what I would consider essential supports, again, in larger schools, especially around guidance and psychologists, but even for something like technology, which I know, we had already scaled back sort of our ambitions for the technology plan. This, I assume, is a further scaling back because it's pitched at 90%. The question is, what aren't we able to do with this?
So, let me give a caveat of this, right? We haven't done what we did in the model, where we actually made certain assumptions about enrollments at schools and drove it out that way. So we haven't said, okay, at this amount of increase for guidance and psychologists, which again, in the model, we talked about providing the same sort of ballpark of services, right? So we haven't said, like we did in that model, we assume that by that time Driscoll is a school of X, and therefore that means that they have Y. Lincoln is a school of Z. It has staffing in this area of that. We haven't done that. But we're close enough in many of these areas, and in fact, in some of these areas, we did not just apply a 90% across the board. I hope I made that clear up front, because I'll go back through some areas, right? We didn't do that. We looked at some areas. We looked at what we were anticipating in the third year of some of them, and we tried to look at the ratio and say, well, what if the ratio were 1 to 600 instead of 1 to 500? I mean, it's not, some of them are not at, like this area is one that's not at the standard of the professional association. We weren't able to do that, right? I think it was 10.3 if I recall the FTE. And we used everything except the original FY18 number in that area. The nurse area was an area that we added 2 instead of 3.3, right? So we didn't use the 1 to 500. I think we scaled it at 1 to 600 instead. And you'll recall that we created our own ratio for that one. It was actually a ratio that said, it's actually 1 to 350 for these students and 1 to 600 for those kinds of things. So we applied a different standard and had some conversations, right, about whether that was something we could figure out in terms of applying it. And in other areas, we said, well, if we're going to implement this literacy initiative, we're going to implement this literacy initiative, right? And while we may not be able to do that in the 65% model, we believe, we didn't predict any of this, we didn't make an assumption, that there may be some reductions in other areas as a result of implementing that and implementing it well. I think I've said to this committee before that some districts have seen a decrease in costs in special education as a result of that literacy initiative. Maybe we have those and we can bake those back in. We didn't make assumptions about them here, but they're certainly on our mind. So that's how we went at this. The technology plan is the original 2.5. Not the original was more than 2.5. Right. Is the 2.5. We did not compromise that, and I'll tell you, we didn't compromise it in the 65% model.
So where are the compromises?
Well, I've highlighted a number of them. Guidance and so we can lay out the original model. We've not done that here. We can easily add the original model and how it stacks up. So you'd have 3 comparisons: the original model, the 90, the 65. That's easy enough to do, right? But it's in. There's a reduction in the high school administration. There's some reduction as a result of the consolidations in assumption in the K to 8. There's a reduction in the high school staffing as a result of us applying that ratio. There's a reduction in central office. There's a reduction in K to 8. There's a reduction in the instructional materials and supplies that I mentioned earlier, in staffing for nurses, I think that's, and in the grade 2 paraprofessionals.
Okay,
that
so
grade 2 paraprofessional model. As I mean, off the top of my head, without having them laid out here as the model, that's where they are.
So when you say that, so that's a great example, because that's an area where I really think we need to be pushing to get there. So you're saying that even at 90%, we would not get to the second grade, the second grade paraprofessional?
That's correct.
In the classroom.
That's
okay.
Correct.
So that to me is, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for. That to me is really significant, because that's been a tremendously successful initiative, and I worry a lot about not being able to move forward with it. There was one other thing you mentioned, and now I'm going to forget what it was. In terms of elementary world language.
Yes.
I know that we're expanding the upper grades. Are we doing extra time? We wanted to play with that, right?
We took 6th grade to our middle level
To our
model,
middle level
45-minute period,
Okay.
but we were only able to provide 3, which is a bit of a scheduling issue.
Okay, so that's scheduling. So in terms of the increase that you're putting towards elementary world language, are we going to be able to
We accomplished 2 things with these
grow
two
grow that program the way we would want to?
We accomplished 2 things with this recommendation, right? 2 things.
Yeah.
We keep pace with our section growth at the because there's 2 recommendations here. We keep pace with our growth in sections at K through 5, right? And we expand 6th grade to 5 times a week.
Right. No, I understand. I understand
Well,
that. Yeah.
Hear me out, because
Okay.
I'm not done yet. So then we have a choice. At that point, we have a choice. There is some FTE, well, we don't think it's much, associated with, can we then begin to offer sixth graders a choice of a language? Do they need to stay in the same model, which is everyone takes fill in the blank, or can they do what the seventh and eighth grade does? And it's close enough in terms of the FTE that we didn't have to bake anything else in there, but that's another decision. And again, as we play this out a little bit more, and as I said last week, we have to be able to add in some of those value-added pieces that you might be able to get from some of these recommendations. But we would be able to accomplish both of those things, and if we chose that third piece as well, and again, I know that our coordinators have some feelings about that, right, within these numbers.
Okay, and one final question that came up at a recent subcommittee meeting. What about the expansion to other schools in the system of the Landmark program? Where is that in these numbers? Because I know that's been something we've been scaling back on.
Yeah, so it's there, but it's there because the program rolls, right? We may have to devote some of the additional dollars we have here in professional development or as one of those areas to it in order to accelerate the roll. But it's baked into a roll. So they're meant to be at a school for 3 years and then move on. So some of the original money that we used at Lawrence became the money we're using at Baker. Next year when school X, Driscoll, is through their 3 years, we can roll that money on to Pierce or wherever we roll that money to.
Right.
Now, in order to make it move faster, what we need to do is add some sum of money to it, but it's not a six-figure number in terms of making it able to roll faster. It's 50,000. It may be something in that neighborhood. So we can accomplish that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Question, in this 90% model, what has happened to library staffing and library materials?
So, nothing at this point. Nothing at this point, although, you know, as we continue to play this out, and I should have said at the beginning of this, I apologize for the lateness of this. We were trying to put two pretty significant presentations together. And so we need to go back because there are some areas of interest, some ideas around some modeling. I mean, one of our, I'll say right up front, one of our goals out of the last X number of budgets has been, that didn't get modeled up front, has been to expand our hours. I mean, I've heard school committee members talk to it. We're interested in it, and we're going to have to look at ways of dealing, you know, with the issues that drove us to the original cut, and see if they can be dealt with in a way, and for what amount of money. And I don't think it's huge numbers that can expand those hours so that kids have access to the libraries till later in the afternoon. And it is a goal of ours to, as we play through this, to have that included. It was actually one of the items on our list for discussion as we were looking at the 90% model. We're not there right now.
Good, thank you. I'm glad to hear there's nothing I'd rather have nothing happen than a reduction.
No, there's not a reduction.
Yeah.
There's not a reduction. Again, as I said, our goal would be to, because we've heard that. Again, I'm not suggesting I know what the model is, but the idea of those spaces open later into the afternoon in whatever configuration or modeling that drives that, that's a goal of ours.
So, one other question, Selectmen asked us to think about changes in enrollment, and the original model had 630, and it says 650. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of that, because that was one of the first few pages?
Right. So, I don't have those original numbers in terms of what that did, but you did that model. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. The, both our FY15 current year kindergarten numbers and projecting higher kindergarten numbers in the future have moved up the demand for classroom and shifted some of the staffing that we originally had projected at the high school down to the elementaries, but in total it's moved us up. It's moved us up more in future years, 19 and 20 in our models, than actually in the 16 through 18 period. So enrollment changes actually shifted some of the resources, but really aren't as much a driver in this 3-year period as they are as we go into the next couple of years after this. So looking at 1 3-year period is, in a sense, an anomaly, but clearly our enrollment is continuing to grow, continue to put more pressure, and beyond the earlier presentation, which is space, it's affecting our budget as well.
So let me say this about all of that. We said in the space presentation, and if I developed assumptions here, I would have included it here as well. We are additional assumptions. We said that we use the historical patterns in terms of our enrollment. Now, that does not mean that we take our kindergarten class and say, well, okay, historically over 12 years, it's been 96.1% at 4th grade. We don't do that. The way we approximate that is we use that number and we continue it across, but we figure in that consolidation. So it's an approximation of that figured over time. And as Mr. Rowe said, we did increase it, which drove larger numbers at K to 8. We used the 4 through 8 numbers, which drove slightly different numbers at the high school level. But because we continue in all the other grades to use the assumption of the number that's there now, right? Some might argue that we've created artificially high conditions in those classes. We believe it all averages out. Really? So if we have,
So can we just go back to the gap page? I think that's the one I'm getting confused about. So, the one forward, yeah, page 2.
oh, 2? 2, 6.
So on this page, on the top of this page, the deficit was calculated based on 630 kindergarten.
Yes,
And 1%.
And a 1%.
right,
And I understand, and it did not include the $1 million in one-time money.
right.
And I understand that we added in the 2% just for modeling assumptions,
Right.
and we added in the one-time money.
Right.
What I don't see here in recalculating gap is the 650. And I guess what I'm hearing you say is that it's kind of baked in later, but I'm confused at the.
What I'm saying again, as I said last week when we discussed this, is that the 650 compared to the 630 doesn't change the total over the 3-year period by any significant amount. It shifts the allocation of resources. If we wanted to change those numbers and do some kind of different modeling, you could do that. But the modeling with this year's enrollment projected forward shifts resources over this 3-year period. It doesn't increase it by any significant amount.
I'm now stuck on the question you asked, but I'm going to try and let go of it for a second. Come back to that. It goes a little bit to Rebecca's point earlier. And I imagine we will get there, and I appreciate where we are in this process. So I'm not asking as if I expected all this baked today. But as we try and just understand the consequence of these numbers, it would be helpful to me, in particular, to really appreciate, in to some extent, narrative form, what your vision and sort of things you wanted to accomplish with our original plan, and how that looks different for this and for 65 in a way that helps me appreciate. So your point, for example, about the literacy initiative was really important. Like, we're saying we're committed to that.
Yeah.
That's a commitment we're making. By saying that we've made other choices where we may be shifting a priority because we can't, and maybe it was a priority, maybe it wasn't, in a different area, in order to make sure we do that or do something else. It would also be helpful to say that this is now shifted in terms of how we think about what we're able to accomplish with that.
Yep.
And maybe it's an executive summary of sorts, just to
That's fine.
focus us, because this is really helpful, actually, to understand the details. But I do think as we go through this, it's going to be not just important for me, but I would imagine too for the selectmen and others to focus their attention. really
Right,
well.
no, I'll say this to that, it's a really good point, thank you. You know, the goal was in those areas that, one of these days I'm gonna get to stop saying catch up, right? So, in those areas, the goal was to make up in some way for the fact that we'd focused on the classroom and we had neglected guidance counselors, we'd neglected nurses, those kinds of things.
Yep.
And what we set out is here are professional association recommendations. And the good news of the 90% model is we've made some real strides in those areas. Now, did we get to those formulas under the, no, we didn't, but we've made some real strides. And I think as we've looked at some examples of what some of them look like, as we play them out over some guesstimates at what enrollments of buildings may be, that we've made a really serious improvement, right? We've not met 1 for 500, but we've made really serious improvement in those areas.
Right, and I think being able to say
Yeah.
how we've made it, where we could have gone if we had
Yeah.
100%, where we're going to go if
Yeah.
we get 90, and where we're going to go with 65 would be really helpful.
Okay, great. Want to talk about 65? Okay, then. Hit the gavel now. You don't want to talk about 65. Okay, so remember, if I go back here, if I go way back here, the gap was another $3.6 million. Okay? That was 1.4 million. This gap is another 3.6. So we've taken that at this point through this exercise. And then I'll show you the comparison between these two. So I'll just walk you through this. So we've actually made a different assumption in terms of staffing for guidance and psychologists. There's still an increase, but it's not the increase we were able to do at the 90%, and therefore it's certainly not the modeling increase. We only increased the high school administration by 1 position over this period of time. We still increased the K-8 staffing at those levels. That remains the same. We made a different assumption at Brookline High School, and we've talked about this. We actually talked about this last week. So the whole high school assumption was based on 1 teacher to every 14.25 students. We did not get any finer than that in the modeling, right? We didn't say that meant 4 plus 1. We didn't say that meant a number of electives. If you go back to my previous presentation, all of those things that I said we might talk about are all baked into that 14.25. Does that make sense? So we ran an exercise here and said, what if that were 1 to 15? And you might say, so what does that mean you cut? And I would say, right, still to be determined. That might be sum of 4 plus 1. That might be some class sectioning. That might be class sizes. That might be a number of things. But again, because our enrollment wasn't increasing as much, we looked at that area for some place where we might make an adjustment in this, and it drove different numbers. And again, you'll see that in the summary. Still increased the vice principal at the old Lincoln School. We actually made a reduction of 1 of the positions at central office in that modeling. We used a 2.5% increase for instructional materials and supplies. We increased the staffing of nurses by slightly less than what we increased in the original model. We still increased the world language staffing for K to 5 like we did elementary teachers, but I don't believe we added the 6th grade component. We did not add the 6th grade component in this model. We increased custodial repair and maintenance by less. And we increased the related services, those regular education interventions, by a considerable lesser amount. We still implemented this version of the technology plan. The $2.5 million model that was in is still there. It's still there. We made no addition to steps to success in this model, and we lowered the amount of innovation funding. It still kept some increase over the period of time, but cut it in half in terms of the base. we were not able to, in this model, fund the literacy support or math support. So these are very much in line with our traditional non-program-based modeling in those areas. Meaning those increases in the 90% model were based on what we're trying to achieve in those areas. We were not able, at least on our first couple runs through this, to make those increases there. So these are much more enrollment-driven increases to meet the numbers of students at buildings rather than program initiative increases. We increased the enrichment and challenge support staffing by only the enrichment and challenge support teachers in this model, not the coordinator, not the associated math interventionists. We still increased the special education staffing, placements, creation of program by the $2.3 million. We moved, and we've talked with Mr. Cronin about this, even at those levels, we leave the $550,000 in the CIP for rental of space in this model. We leave it there. By the way, we even though it's not shown on this slide, we move the additional rental of space to the CIP in this model. This model can simply not support the programmatic improvements that we've looked at here in the 90% model, even that we've looked at in the 65% model, and absorb that $750,000 in costs for rental of space that we know under almost any assumption is coming. And we left the assumption for the startup of Old Lincoln School where it was. So the comparison, or do you want me to stop there? I'll run through the comparison, and then you can. So the comparison, this is the layout of the comparison. And again, a great suggestion, we'll lay out the model opposed to, against this. So you see the increases in staffing. You see the increases in vice principal, central administration, instructional materials, staffing for school nurses. World language is the same, but again, doesn't add that sixth grade component. Custodial, repair, and maintenance. What? The K to 5 is.
Yeah.
But the sixth grade is not. But the K to 5, right, the K to 5 is. The technology plan and steps to success is not implemented in this model against the other model. Innovation funding is reduced. The middle level world language program, there it is, Ms. Charlevsky, is not there. The literacy staffing is reduced. The math specialist staffing is reduced. Again, they are now, those are numbers that are much more based on enrollment increases instead of the program that we're trying to drive. And enrichment and challenge is support, and the 550, and I would note the 200,000 that hasn't appeared yet, is all driven somewhere else. There's one other thing that I need to point out here that I just want to make sure continues to be on the table. The override scenarios, all of them assume that the enrollment component in the town-school partnership disappears. Okay? The enrollment component of the town-school partnership disappears in all of the assumptions that have been made around these override scenarios. And I have to say that I believe in the 65% model, that any discussion of the 65% model would need to include in order to actually advance some of the issues that we've tried to build into these models and that we've tried to program for the benefit of our teachers, our students, our schools, would have to revisit that conversation about whether that model could factor out or shouldn't factor out some allocation for enrollment in the base town-school partnership. So do you want to say a word about this one, Mr. Rowe?
Sure. If you go back to what we were talking about a little while ago in terms of having to get a $5 million reduction. Our original set of recommendations that we proposed last year when we were presenting to the Overhead Study Committee, separate from the technology budget and special ed and ELL teacher staffing, was an $8.3 million package. This package still has the technology, save for the $75,000 per year.
Sorry, I didn't say that.
That's okay. We reduced the technology package by one position each year, 16, 17, and 18. So save for that one change in the staffing, the full technology budget has remained. And the full special education and ELL teacher staffing has remained. But in order to get to the 90% option, we had to reduce the package by $1.6 million. And the reason we did that to meet the $1.4 million target was because we added back $200,000 worth of rental of space in FY '17. And then to get to the 65 package, we did another $2.8 million worth of reduction out of the package. The reason we didn't have to do more than that is we took that $550,000 number out. So can I just go? Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask Dr. Fisher-Mueller to say a word about a couple of the program reductions, particularly I think in the 65% model, that she can speak to better than I.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on this, and what's difficult is to paint a clear picture of what this cut would look like. The best I can do is describe for you, maybe in a metaphor, if you will, that when you are shopping in the grocery store and they close down 2 registers, you have to get in the other line and you wait longer. That's a very, very simple way of saying that this 65% cut changes the fundamental delivery, if you will, of the instruction and the teaching and learning that the Brookline parents are used to. And I am entertaining questions and requests from parents now with the challenges that we have. And as we talk about a cut of this nature, the parents will not be receiving, their children will not be receiving the education that they expect. When we talk about the math specialists and their availability not only for intervention, but for extension. The literacy specialists, not only for intervention, but for actually creating an interdisciplinary unit in science. The science department not actually having all the materials and the updated microscopes or the microscopes that need to be fixed and sent out for upgrade, excuse me for stumbling on that, but it is about kids sharing and not having what they need at their desk at that time. And what's very, very difficult is our teachers have almost done too good a job of adjusting with less than. And this takes what we have been struggling with now for a few years, and it lops off even a greater amount. So going back to science, inquiry science is expensive. It's expensive. It requires high quality materials. And so when we cut our instruction number, our thank you, materials number, while you see a number there, what you don't see actually is the material not upgraded, the actual numbers of materials present in front of kids such that they don't have to share, they don't have to take turns. So it's an extremely difficult picture to paint until kids experience it. And then we get the calls. And then we look at our scores. And then we review our data. And our hardworking teachers come to the table and ask, what can they do? What can they do more? What they can do differently? And so I appreciate the opportunity to actually write the narrative, if you will, that describes the picture. I am much more excited at the opportunity to describe what the 90% can get us and allow us to take the steps that are necessary and that are expected than the difficult picture that we would be painting with the 65.
So,
I think so. Oh, Mr. Rowe has 2 more slides.
Well, I just wanted to tie the numbers together. I mean, if you don't want to see these, that's fine.
How could I not let you show those slides?
Fine.
I'm sorry.
All I wanted to do was point out that, remember, our targets for the 12.8 and the 9.2 numbers that would come to us as net revenue over and above the regular town appropriation if we got overrides and other funding that yielded the 90% and the 65%. And so what we've done is we've built our projections, which include all of the costs that we're anticipating, including growth of special education services, which would include both direct service staff and private placement, as well as step and lane growth, collective bargaining at 2%, a contingency in the $225,000 range, and then the other areas which are taken directly from the models that we were talking about. So I just wanted to show you that this package ties back to the original package that we had been working with. So this is why we wanted to make it clear that we had to reduce to get to the 90%, and we had to reduce significantly further to get to the 65%.
Thank you, Bill. Question about laws of unintended consequences between 65% and 90%. So I'm focusing on the difference in terms of staffing on literacy specialists as well as math specialists between the 65 and 90%. Obviously, substantial reduction in the 65%. So in light of that, my question is then the base assumption on special ed funding, is that still valid?
So
More. You may need
I don't
more.
think so, right? I think we probably need to, I mean, it reminds me of the class size conversations, right? I mean, people talk about all kinds of things in class size. The one thing that I've seen pretty regularly in a lot of that research is that you have more referrals in larger classes. And if you have more referrals, you have more students who end up with IEPs. If you have more IEPs, you have more district-wide placements. If you have more district-wide placements, you have more out-of-district placements. So, you know, those costs multiply. So, sure, you may not see X or Y or Z research in the area of class size, but I think it's pretty consistent that you at least see more referrals. And I think these are interventions, right? And they're interventions that have been, we've talked about a formula, right? I don't know all the pieces. I can't tell you each piece of the formula and how and what percentage each piece is responsible for some of the successes that we've seen in having students served well in Brookline, which means less out-of-district placements, more parents willing to work with us around strategies in Brookline. Landmark's certainly been part of that. There are other pieces that our team facilitators, some of which you see baked into this in terms of the increases to keep pace with our numbers of students. But yeah, there's a consequence. There's a consequence. I mean, we believe, because when we studied other districts, we believe that we saw that a number of them actually reduced learning support areas, other kinds of programs, special education referrals, when they implemented the literacy program with Fidelity, right? And we believe we will experience that over time. It's going to be, Dr. Fisher-Miller, Dr. Schmuckler both remind me that you're not going to see those as evident because, remember, we're growing at the same time. But they are strategies that mean a lot to that individual kid, to that individual parent, and may prevent those kinds. So sure, there are going to be some of that. You know, I think we said last week that there were certain things that if we did, we were going to have to create a factor for them. I think we have a little bit more work to do in looking at the 65% model and figuring that out. I said to you last week that you could take X amount for, I believe, for tutorial, right? And I believe that you're going to have to set over here as a contingency this amount of money for the unintended consequences. I believe that. And I would recommend that in terms of any kind of budgeting. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this, Dr. Lapini. This is great. The comparison is really, in particular, is really helpful. One of the things I noticed, and you emphasized it as well, is that you preserve the technology funding throughout. That's a choice, you know, in terms of where to make reductions and not make reductions. Can you talk a little bit about the motivation to preserve that budget as opposed to spreading it out elsewhere?
So we did look at a couple of scenarios where we actually pushed it out into additional years, as an example. You know, I think it goes back to the things that we talked about in terms of the improvement in the classroom and the individual nature of the experience that we were able to create for kids. I mean, we've seen, you've heard here, you've heard other places about what we've been able to accomplish with the initial investment that we've made this year in terms of the classroom, in terms of what's available for individual students, the avenues for learning that opens up for kids in the classroom. And quite frankly, it is not lost upon us that our teachers continue to say, finally, this district begins to feel like the other districts where I had opportunity to go and work. So it was not an area, again, given that we view this plan, we don't view this plan as extravagant. We view this plan as pretty much basic, you know, utilities on the wall kind of a plan. We were worried about backing off of that for all of those reasons.
May I just offer a very quick anecdote? So I had a conversation very recently with Corey Stott, who you have met as our Director of Research and Accountability. And Corey has identified a tool for us that would allow us teachers to input immediately assessment data, both in math and in literacy on a regular basis. And it then creates a picture of every child's assessments when, in fact, may I remind you that the assessments that we are using are not like kids taking tests. All right, they sometimes don't even know they're being assessed. They are doing a particular activity, both in math and in literacy. And we talked about that tool and how excited we are all about that tool, and the inability right now for us to make a multi-year commitment to that tool. That we're looking at a one-year commitment right now because we don't know how far out we're going to be able to go with technology, as one example. In the absence of having accurate data on where students are across the board, we can't then tailor that instruction very specifically to that child so that every student is advancing and learning, regardless of where they start. It's just a quick anecdote of our reality.
I know I probably shouldn't mix these yet. Probably like mixing bad alcohol, but which is all I can think about right now at 9:30. But as you've thought about what you shared on the options for short-term and long-term space, and now we talk about operational budget.
Yeah.
I'm making the assumption that, let's say we got 90% and we picked option X, we'd still be okay to implement 90%. In other words, is there anything we should be thinking about or understanding in terms of any trade-offs that what happens over here affects what happens over there? Or have you all figured all that out in the sense that, like, no, programming is programming, if we get mobiles, if we move kids here, there, or elsewhere, we can still generally execute against these different scenarios without too much
Yes.
fluctuation? Is that a safe
Yes.
assumption?
Yes, we have, and yes, we believe that's the case. Thank you for that question, though. It's a really good one because these two things, there's a great deal of interaction here, and we did have those discussions in creating both.
So I just want to I thank Jennifer for those two anecdotes, which were really helpful, and get back just one more time to reinforce what Lisa said earlier, which is that, we all know these numbers pretty well, and they are hard to absorb without the narrative. And so, especially for audiences that are not as familiar with them,
Yes.
that narrative is so crucial.
We'll have that for the 10th, and we'll make sure you see it before then.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Just a detailed question. I thought I saw at the beginning of the 65 an assumption of 2 consolidations
Right.
versus 1 in the previous model.
I skipped over.
What does that mean, that we just assume that we can consolidate more classrooms? Does that ultimately mean we assume that we're going to have larger class size?
It does. It means that some of those things I probably got red in the face talking about earlier, we might have to do. We have to be more careful with those kinds of assignments. We might have to violate some of those, but because one we can get, the second one has to be driven with strategies beyond where we are now. Yes.
You'll spell that out in terms of the negative consequence that's embedded into that assumption.
But we will, yeah.
Thank you.
Following up on Lisa's question, and maybe I don't understand it as well, but I thought that there would be a difference if we went at just the cost of borrowing just for devotion versus borrowing a higher amount for the debt exclusion.
Yeah, no, that isn't what I thought I was asked. I thought I was
wasn't
asked
the
about
question you
operating
asked.
budget implications.
Right, so I was asking, if you go back to our first conversation about options for short-term solutions to space.
Right.
And let's say we create some composite of 3 different things we're gonna do.
Right.
Out of that, which I know
Well, I
sits in
see
the
what
debt
you're saying.
exclusion space. And then we say, let's say we get 65% or 90%, whatever it is. I was just trying to test the assumption that what we got, that we could do on the programming side, on the operational side, regardless of which options we picked and vice versa. I was just trying to make sure that was the right assumption to hold, as opposed to saying, you know what, if we actually picked this option and this option, we couldn't do the technology plan this way, or these numbers would change because we do something different with nursing.
No,
I'm
and the
totally
one,
making it up,
but the technology plan is the one where we probably played with this the most, and we're pretty confident of that plan within those assumptions. That make sense? So we have some, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
There's a lot of stuff in this plan that you've presented tonight that is kind of difficult to wrap your head around. And I like the notion of the narrative that Lisa has brought up.
Right.
And I'm wondering if it's possible for us as a committee to have a discussion about that narrative before we take it to the Board of Selectmen. I mean, it might mean adding an extra meeting, but I think it would be very helpful for all of us to really have a better grasp of this, if that's something we could do.
No, actually, not for next week, it's not. I'm cognizant of the amount of time that I asked senior staff to take away from everything else that they did this week to devote to these 2 tasks and the timing to get this narrative done, which we certainly can do. And then I'm also worried on the other end about what I do out of that conversation were it to occur from middle on of next week, and how I get that ready for the 10th. So those are the 2 most immediate thoughts that came to mind. Within that, I have MSAN and MASC next week, but can certainly. I think I said to the chair, I would be available. I think Thursday night. I'd have to cut MASC short to do that, but I could be here Thursday evening.
Why don't we, I'm hearing enough discomfort on the narrative that I think we need to talk about how we're going to do this next week. Why don't we try scheduling this offline? But I'm hearing, okay. We'll try to figure out something.
And to be clear, I didn't mean to suggest that I had discomfort with the narrative as much as to the extent that there is a narrative that you are using.
Yeah.
As you're doing this, I know for us, you may have just gone straight to it, but to lift that up and make it explicit is sort of what I was hoping for.
I can give you a timeline on that tomorrow, on when you'll have that in your hands. I want to talk to senior staff about it, but I'll do it tomorrow.
All right, we might actually be at the end of our school committee meeting, possibly.
There never seems to be a good time. I had hoped at our workshop to bring you the model of a new school committee website homepage that Ms. Stone and Dr. Jackson and I developed this summer. But it doesn't seem like we have a lot of time in these meetings. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to send it to everyone for your comment. And I will send it out tomorrow electronically, and ideally if you have some time in the next week. You can send it back. As I understand from the IT department, they're working on website reboot over the fall, so I'd like to get it done sooner rather than later, and then make it their problem.
Just to understand, this is the school committee website? Okay.
I'll send you a homepage.